There are places where sound goes to die, and for 3 days in August of 1987, Pyramid Lake became one of them. Pyramid Lake sits 33 miles northeast of Reno, Nevada, a remnant of ancient Lake Lahontan that once covered much of the Great Basin during the Pleistocene epoch. The lake stretches across nearly 200 square miles of desert, its waters a peculiar shade of turquoise that shifts with the light. The Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe has inhabited its shores for thousands of years, and their oral histories speak of the lake as a living entity, one that listens, remembers, and occasionally responds. The western shore is the most remote section of the lake, accessible only by unmarked dirt roads that wind through sagebrush and volcanic rock formations. The tufa formations that give the lake its name rise from the water like ancient monuments, calcium carbonate deposits shaped by millennia of mineral-rich springs. Few people venture to this area. The terrain is unforgiving, the roads barely maintained, and cell phone coverage has never existed there. In the summer of 1987, the western shore was even more isolated than usual. Budget cuts had reduced the number of tribal rangers patrolling the area, and the Bureau of Land Management had closed several access roads due to flash flood damage that spring. The handful of fishermen who knew the area well enough to navigate it represented the only regular human presence for miles. On August 14, 1987, 4 men drove separately to the western shore to fish for kiwi, an endangered suckerfish found only in Pyramid Lake. They didn't know each other. They arrived at different times throughout the morning, parked at various points along a 3-mile stretch of shoreline, and set up their equipment in the pre-dawn darkness. By 9:30 that morning, all 4 men had packed up their gear and driven back to Nixon, the small community at the lake's southern end. Each man went directly to the tribal police station. Each man reported the same thing. The silence had started sometime around 6:15 in the morning, though none of them had noticed it immediately. Thomas Winnemucca, a 52-year-old contractor from Sparks, was the first to mention it in his statement. He'd been checking his fishing line when he realized he couldn't hear the water lapping against the rocks. He thought perhaps the wind had died down, but when he looked at the lake, he could see ripples moving across the surface. The water was moving, but it made no sound. He stood up and took a few steps toward the shoreline. His boots struck the rocky beach, but he heard nothing. He clapped his hands together. Silence. He shouted toward the lake. His mouth moved, his throat vibrated, but no sound reached his ears. David Martinez, a 60-year-old retired electrician, had been fishing about half a mile south of Winnemucca. His account, given 3 hours later to Officer Usa, Raymond Hooper of the tribal police, described the same phenomenon. Martinez had been listening to a portable radio. He remembered hearing a weather report at 6:10 when the broadcast simply stopped. Not static, not a fade, just an absence where sound had been. He assumed the batteries had died, but when he looked at the radio, the dial lights were still on, the tuner still glowed red. He removed his headphones, and that's when he noticed the silence. He described it in his statement as the loudest quiet I've ever heard. He packed his equipment within minutes and drove back to Nixon, certain something was medically wrong with him. He went to the tribal police station only because the health clinic was closed on Sundays. The third fisherman, Robert Blackburn, a 41-year-old warehouse supervisor, didn't report his experience until the following day. He'd been further north than the others, nearly 2 miles from Winnemucca's location. According to his written statement, he'd been fishing for almost 2 hours before he realized something was wrong. He'd been so focused on his line that he hadn't registered the absence of environmental sound. It was only when a large bird, he thought it might have been a pelican, flew directly over his head that he looked up. The bird's wings were beating, its beak was open, but he heard nothing. Blackburn described walking along the shoreline for nearly 20 minutes, testing the silence. He threw rocks into the water. He kicked at the tufa formations. He got back in his truck and honked the horn. Nothing. He could feel the vibration of the horn through the steering wheel, could see the panic in his own reflection in the rearview mirror, but no sound penetrated the air around him. The fourth man never gave his name. Officer Hooper's report refers to him only as Subject D, a designation usually reserved for witnesses who request anonymity. According to Hooper's notes, Subject D appeared at the station around 2 in the afternoon, visibly shaken. He reported experiencing the silence, but provided few details about his location or the duration of his exposure. What he did report was that the silence had followed him. Even after driving 15 miles back to Nixon, even inside the police station surrounded by voices and radio chatter, he claimed he could still feel the silence underneath everything else, like a second layer of reality pressing against the normal world. Hooper contacted the Bureau of Indian Affairs that afternoon. By Monday morning, a team from the University of Nevada, Reno arrived at Pyramid Lake with acoustic monitoring equipment. Dr. Sarah Teller, a geophysicist specializing in seismic activity, led the team. Her preliminary report, filed with the BIA on August 18th, noted several unusual features of the western shore, but offered no explanation for the reported phenomenon. The team had set up monitoring stations at 5 locations along the western shore, including GPS coordinates that approximately matched where the fishermen had been positioned. For 72 hours, the equipment recorded ambient sound levels, seismic activity, electromagnetic readings, and atmospheric pressure. According to the data, nothing unusual occurred. Sound levels remained consistent with typical desert lake environments, wind, water movement, occasional wildlife. But the fishermen weren't the only ones who experienced the silence. On August 15th, the second day of the monitoring period, 2 members of Dr. Teller's team reported brief episodes of auditory distortion while checking equipment at the northernmost station. Graduate student Marcus Webb described it as a dampening effect, like someone had thrown a blanket over the world. It lasted less than 30 seconds. His colleague, Dr. Patricia Nguyen, experienced a similar episode approximately 2 hours later at a different location. Neither incident was captured by the recording equipment. On August 16th, the silence returned in full. Dr. Teller was at the Southern Monitoring Station when it happened. Her field notes, later included in a supplementary report, described the onset as instantaneous. At 11:43 in the morning, all sound ceased. The monitoring equipment continued to function. She could see the digital displays updating, the reels of magnetic tape turning, but she heard nothing. She attempted to radio her team. The radio handset vibrated in her palm as she pressed the transmit button, but no sound emerged. She walked to her vehicle and started the engine. The dashboard lights indicated the engine was running, but she heard nothing. The silence lasted for approximately 11 minutes. Dr. Teller noted in her report that she experienced significant spatial disorientation during this period, despite standing on flat open terrain in broad daylight. She described a sensation of being untethered from location, as though the absence of sound had somehow disrupted her proprioceptive sense. When sound returned, it did so gradually, fading in over the course of 15 to 20 seconds. 4 other team members reported similar experiences that day, each occurring at different times and locations along the western shore. The monitoring equipment, when analyzed back at the university, showed no corresponding anomalies. The magnetic tapes contained continuous recordings of ambient sound throughout the periods when team members reported experiencing silence. On August 17th, Dr. Teller submitted her final report to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The report concluded that while multiple credible witnesses had reported unusual auditory experiences, no physical mechanism could be identified to explain the phenomenon. She recommended further study, but noted that without reproducible data, additional research would be difficult to justify. The Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe declined to authorize further studies on the western shore. In a brief statement issued through the Tribal Council, Chairman Marvin Hooper indicated that the area would remain open to tribal members, but that outside researchers would no longer be permitted access. No explanation was provided. In the months following the incident, 3 of the 4 original fishermen reported persistent auditory disturbances. Thomas Winnemucca told a reporter from the Reno Gazette-Journal that he occasionally experienced brief moments where sound would drop out, usually lasting only a second or two. David Martinez described a similar pattern. Robert Blackburn declined to be interviewed, but reportedly told friends he'd stopped fishing altogether. Subject D was never identified publicly, and Officer Raymond Hooper's report contains no follow-up information about him. Dr. Teller published a paper on the Pyramid Lake incident in 1989 in the Journal of Environmental Acoustics. The paper focused primarily on the psychological effects of acute sensory deprivation in outdoor environments and made only passing reference to the monitoring data. She left the University of Nevada in 1991 and currently works in private consulting. She has declined all interview requests about Pyramid Lake since 1993. The western shore of Pyramid Lake remains accessible to tribal members and authorized visitors. Fishermen still venture there, though fewer than before. Those who do report nothing unusual, though few stay longer than a few hours. The monitoring equipment Dr. Teller's team installed was removed in September of 1987. The data tapes were archived at the University of Nevada's Seismology Laboratory. In 2004, during a routine inventory, archivists discovered that 3 of the 5 tapes from August 16th, the day Dr. Teller and her team experienced the full silence, were missing from the collection. No explanation was recorded. No investigation was launched. On certain mornings, when the wind is low and the light hits the water just right, the western shore of Pyramid Lake looks exactly as it did in August of 1987. The tufa formations still rise from the turquoise water. The sagebrush still dots the rocky beach. And somewhere in that vast, empty landscape, sound goes about its business, until suddenly, for reasons no one has explained, it doesn't. Some sounds persist long after their source has been severed, and in March of 1994, a payphone in the Nevada desert rang for 11 days without stopping. Goldfield sits in Esmeralda County, roughly halfway between Reno and Las Vegas, along Highway 95, a town that once held 20,000 people during the gold rush of the early 1900s, but now claims fewer than 300 permanent residents. The landscape surrounding it is high desert, sparse creosote bush, distant mountain ranges, and an expanse of sky that feels larger than it should. Buildings from the mining boom still stand along the main street, their facades maintained by historical societies and the occasional ghost tour operator, but most of Goldfield exists in a state of managed decay. 3 miles south of town, just off Highway 95, sits what locals still call the Sanderson Station, though it hasn't operated under that name since 1978. The gas station closed for good in October of 1992 after the highway was rerouted slightly east, making the station invisible to passing traffic. By early 1993, the pumps had been removed, the underground tanks drained and filled with sand, and the small attached convenience store stripped of anything valuable. All that remained was a cinder block building with 2 large windows, a collapsed awning, and a payphone mounted on the exterior wall facing the highway. The payphone had been installed by Pacific Bell in 1969 and serviced intermittently until the station closed. According to records from the Nevada Public Utilities Commission, service to that line was officially terminated on November 3, 1992. The phone itself remained mounted to the wall, a weathered aluminum booth with a hinged door that no longer closed properly, and a handset dangling from a steel cord. On March 7, 1994, the phone began to ring. Sheriff's Deputy Angela Morales was the first to document it. She'd been patrolling Highway 95 on her regular route when she pulled into the abandoned station lot to complete paperwork. In her incident report, filed later that afternoon, she noted hearing a phone ringing as she exited her vehicle. She initially assumed it was her radio, but the sound was coming from the payphone. She walked over to it and lifted the handset. The ringing stopped immediately, but there was no sound on the line, no dial tone, no static, no voice. She hung up. Within seconds, the phone began ringing again. Morales tested the phone by lifting the handset twice more. Each time, the ringing stopped when she answered and resumed when she hung up. She noted in her report that the ringer sounded normal, not distorted or mechanical, just a standard bell tone that echoed across the empty lot. She contacted Pacific Bell from her patrol radio. The company confirmed that the line had been disconnected 16 months earlier and that no service calls had been scheduled for that location. By March 8th, the phone was still ringing. Deputy Morales drove past the station twice that day and heard it both times. She mentioned it to Sheriff Raymond Huerta, who drove out to investigate that evening. His report describes the phone as ringing continuously with normal intervals, approximately 4 seconds of ringing, followed by 3 seconds of silence. He attempted to answer it multiple times. Each time the line was silent, and the ringing resumed after he replaced the handset. Sheriff Huerta contacted Pacific Bell again on March 9th. A technician arrived at the station on March 10th, a Thursday afternoon. According to the service report filed by technician Brian Kowalski, the phone line had been physically cut at the junction box 200 yards from the station. There was no electrical connection between the phone and the network. Kowalski removed the phone's interior mechanism to examine it. The ringer assembly was intact, but there was no power source, no batteries, no capacitors holding residual charge. He reassembled the phone and watched as it continued to ring at regular intervals, the bell inside striking clearly despite having no apparent means to do so. Kowalski's report, submitted to Pacific Bell's regional office in Reno, recommended that the phone be removed entirely. The request was filed but not acted upon. The phone continued to ring. By March 12th, word had spread through Goldfield. Several residents drove out to the station to hear it for themselves. Among them was Richard Duval, a retired electrical engineer who had moved to Goldfield in 1989. Duval brought a voltmeter and a tape recorder. He spent 3 hours at the station on the afternoon of March 12th, documenting the phone's behavior. His notes, later shared with a reporter from the Reno Gazette-Journal, described the ringing as mechanically perfect, with intervals that never varied. He measured no electrical current in the phone's wiring. He opened the phone's casing again and photographed the interior. The mechanism appeared entirely inert, except when the bell struck. He recorded 45 minutes of the ringing and took the tape home to analyze. When he played it back, he noted that the recording quality was unusually clear, with none of the ambient wind noise that should have been present given the open desert location. Duval returned on March 13th with a colleague, former physicist Dr. Helen Ortega, who'd worked at the Nevada test site in the 1970s. Together, they conducted additional measurements. Dr. Ortega brought a radiation detector, concerned that residual contamination from Cold War-era atmospheric testing might be involved, though the station was well outside known fallout zones. They detected no radiation above background levels. They found no electromagnetic anomalies. The phone continued to ring. Local teenagers began visiting the station at night. Most of them lifted the handset, heard nothing, and left. A few claimed they heard something, a faint hiss, a barely perceptible hum breathing. None of these accounts were consistent with each other, and Sheriff Huerta discouraged nighttime visits after finding evidence of vandalism at the site on March 15th. On March 16th, A journalist from Las Vegas named Michael Brennan drove to Goldfield to investigate. He spent most of the day at the station, interviewing locals and recording the phone. His article, published in the Las Vegas Sun on March 19th, included quotes from several witnesses and a brief interview with Deputy Morales. Brennan described answering the phone multiple times and hearing only silence, what he characterized as an active silence, if that makes sense, like a room where someone has just stopped speaking. The article attracted modest regional attention. A television crew from Reno visited on March 17th, but left after an hour when their audio equipment malfunctioned. The correspondent later told colleagues that every recording they attempted contained a low-frequency hum that made the footage unusable. On March 18th, day 11, Nevada State Trooper Dennis McAllister stopped at the station while responding to an unrelated call. He'd heard about the phone but hadn't encountered it himself. When he arrived, it was ringing. He parked his vehicle and walked to the phone booth. According to his statement, given to Sheriff Huerta later that day, he stood there for several minutes, listening to the ring cycle repeat. He decided to answer it. He lifted the handset and put it to his ear. In his written statement, McAllister described what he heard as a recording of nothing. Not silence, he clarified, but the sound of empty space being recorded, the acoustic quality of a room with no one in it. No ambient noise, just the faint presence of air and distance. He could hear what he described as room tone, the barely perceptible background hum that exists in any enclosed space. But there was no room, no enclosure, just that sound, continuous and unchanging. He listened for approximately 90 seconds before hanging up. The phone did not ring again. Pacific Bell sent a crew to remove the phone on March 21st. By then, it had been silent for 3 days. Workers dismantled the entire booth, cutting the mounting bracket from the cinder block wall and loading everything into a truck. The phone was taken to a Pacific Bell facility in Reno for examination. The examination report, dated April 2, 1994, noted that the phone's mechanism was in poor condition consistent with prolonged exposure to desert climate, but showed no evidence of tampering or modification. The report concluded that the phone could not have produced a ringing sound without an external power source, which had not been present. The report offered no explanation for the documented ringing. The phone was disposed of according to standard decommissioning procedures. Sheriff Huerta's office fielded occasional inquiries about the incident throughout the spring and summer of 1994. Most were from curiosity seekers or paranormal enthusiasts. Huerta provided a brief summary of the documented facts and declined further comment. The case file remains open, though no active investigation has been conducted since March of 1994. Richard Duvall attempted to analyze his tape recording in the months following the incident. He sent copies to colleagues at various universities, hoping for insight into the acoustic properties of the ringing. Most recipients confirmed that the recording was authentic and unaltered, but could offer no explanation for the absence of environmental noise or the mechanical precision of the intervals. Dr. Ortega, who'd accompanied Duvall to the station, told him privately that she believed the phone was functioning as a receiver for something, but declined to speculate further. The Sanderson station still stands 3 miles south of Goldfield. The building remains abandoned, its windows now boarded, the lot overgrown with desert scrub. The section of wall where the payphone had been mounted shows a rectangular discoloration, slightly darker than the surrounding cinder block, and 4 bolt holes where the mounting bracket was attached. Occasionally, travelers pull into the lot, having read about the incident online or in regional mystery compilations. They find nothing unusual. The wind moves through the empty lot. The highway hums in the distance. The space where the phone used to be holds only absence now, and the particular quality of silence that follows when something stops ringing after 11 days. But those who stood in that lot in March of 1994 and listened to that phone, they remember the intervals. 4 seconds of ringing, 3 seconds of silence, over and over, without variation, without source, without reason. And some of them, late at night, when ambient noise drops away and the world becomes very quiet, still hear it. Some places exist only in the memory of instruments, and in the summer of 1979, 3 survey teams found the same location that wasn't there. The Pahranagat Valley runs north to south through Lincoln County in southeastern Nevada, a narrow strip of green fed by natural springs in otherwise arid high desert. The valley floor sits at roughly 3,800 feet elevation, flanked by the Pahranagat Range to the west and the East Pahranagat Range to the east. Indigenous Paiute people inhabited the area for thousands of years before European contact, and their name for the valley translates roughly as Valley of Shining Waters. The springs that feed the valley emerge from deep aquifers, some of the oldest groundwater in North America, filtered through limestone and volcanic rock over millennia. In the 1970s, the valley remained sparsely populated, home to a few hundred ranchers and the small communities of Alamo and Hiko. The Bureau of Land Management controlled most of the surrounding territory, and the Pahranagat National Wildlife Refuge, established in 1963, protected crucial wetland habitat at the valley's southern end. North of the refuge, Bureau land stretched for miles, undeveloped, rarely visited, mapped primarily through aerial photography and occasional ground surveys. It was this northern section that drew the attention of the United States Geological Survey in 1979. The agency had been conducting a comprehensive mineral assessment of Nevada's federal lands, part of a multi-year program to catalog potential resources. The Pahranagat Valley Survey was a small component of this larger effort, scheduled for late May through early July, when weather conditions were most favorable. On May 21, 1979, 3 geological survey teams arrived in the Pahranagat Valley. They'd been organized to maximize efficiency. Team A would cover the western slopes of the valley. Team B would survey the valley floor and eastern approaches, and Team C would map the northernmost sections near the Nellis Air Force Range boundary. Each team consisted of 2 to 3 geologists equipped with standard field equipment: compasses, altimeters, topographic maps, rock hammers, sample bags, and newly issued GPS receivers. The GPS technology in 1979 was primitive by later standards. The Navstar satellite constellation was still incomplete, providing only intermittent coverage. The receivers were large, battery-intensive devices that took several minutes to acquire satellite signals and provided accuracy within approximately 100 feet under ideal conditions. Despite these limitations, the USGS had begun integrating GPS into field surveys, recognizing the technology's potential for precise location data. Team A, led by geologist Dr. Frank Kowalski, began their survey on May 22nd. Dr. Kowalski, a 34-year-old structural geologist from the University of Nevada, was accompanied by field assistant Janet Torres and graduate student Mark Vickers. They established a base camp 3 miles northwest of Alamo and began systematic traverses of the western slope. On the afternoon of May 24th, while documenting a series of limestone outcrops approximately 6 miles north of their base camp, Vickers activated the GPS receiver to log their position. The device acquired satellites normally, but then displayed coordinates that didn't correspond to their location. According to Vickers' field notes, the GPS indicated they were 400 feet below the surface at a point roughly 2 miles east of their actual position. Vickers assumed the reading was erroneous, a common occurrence with early GPS technology. He reset the device and waited for it to reacquire satellites. When it did, it displayed the same coordinates. Dr. Kowalski examined the receiver and noted the anomaly in his field log. They marked their actual position using traditional triangulation from known landmarks and continued their work. Team B encountered the same coordinates 3 days later. Geologists Linda Abernathy and David Sanchez had been surveying the valley floor when their GPS receiver produced what Sanchez described in his notes as a persistent error. The coordinates appeared on their screen, remained stable for approximately 4 minutes, then reverted to showing their correct surface position. The anomalous coordinates, when Sanchez later compared notes with Team A, were identical to those Vickers had recorded, the same latitude and longitude, the same depth reading of 400 feet below surface level. Team C's experience was more unsettling. Dr. Patricia O'Brien, a geomorphologist from the Colorado School of Mines, had been working with technician Robert Yamamoto near the northern extent of the survey area. On June 2nd, their GPS receiver began displaying the anomalous coordinates without them requesting a position reading. The device was supposedly in standby mode, conserving battery, but its screen activated and showed the now familiar location 400 feet beneath the valley floor. Dr. O'Brien's field notes describe attempting to shut off the device, but it remained active for nearly 20 minutes, continuously displaying the same coordinates. When the device finally returned to normal function, Yamamoto removed the batteries entirely and made a note to report the malfunction to the equipment pool when they returned to the regional office. The 3 teams converged at a meeting in Alamo on June 7th to coordinate their remaining survey work. During this meeting, they compared field notes and discovered they'd all encountered the identical GPS anomaly. Dr. Kowalski produced a topographic map and had each team indicate where their receivers had displayed the erroneous coordinates. When plotted, all 3 points of anomalous readings, despite occurring at different times and different locations across the valley, pointed to the same underground position. The coordinates, when examined on detailed maps, corresponded to a point beneath the valley floor approximately 12 miles north of Alamo. There was nothing remarkable about the surface location. No structures, no unusual geological features visible in aerial photographs, just high desert scrubland indistinguishable from thousands of other acres in the region. But 400 feet beneath that unremarkable spot, something had captured the attention of 3 different GPS receivers across a span of 2 weeks. Dr. Kowalski contacted the USGS regional supervisor, Dr. Howard Mitchell, on June 8th. Mitchell drove to Alamo and reviewed the team's documentation. According to notes from that meeting, Mitchell was skeptical that 3 separate devices would produce identical erroneous readings, but acknowledged the consistency was unusual. He instructed the teams to continue their work and to document any further GPS anomalies. He collected the field notes related to the coordinate readings and returned to the regional office in Carson City. The survey teams completed their field work in early July and submitted their findings. The final reports focused on mineral deposits, geological structures, and stratigraphic relationships, standard elements of such surveys. None of the reports mentioned the GPS anomaly. Dr. O'Brien later told a colleague that she'd been instructed to remove all references to the coordinates from her draft report before final submission. In August of 1979, Dr. Kowalski requested information from the USGS about drilling records, or seismic surveys, in the Pahranagat Valley, particularly any data related to subsurface structures at the depth where the coordinates had appeared. His request was acknowledged, but no information was provided. A follow-up request in September went unanswered. By December of 1979, 2 unusual developments had occurred. First, the complete field documentation from the Pahranagat Valley Survey, including maps, field notes, sample logs, and equipment calibration records had been relocated within the USGS archive system. Requests for these materials were met with responses indicating the documents were in transit between storage facilities or undergoing reorganization. By March of 1980, multiple inquiries from Dr. Kowalski and Dr. O'Brien established that the documents could not be located. Second, Dr. Howard Mitchell, the regional supervisor who'd collected the team's notes about the coordinate anomaly, had accepted a position with a private mining consultant in Montana. His departure was effective January 15, 1980, and he left no forwarding contact information with the USGS. Janet Torres, the field assistant from Team A, attempted to file a Freedom of Information Act request in 1981 for any documents related to the Pahranagat survey. The request was acknowledged, but the response, received 4 months later, stated that no responsive documents could be located in USGS files. A reference librarian at the National Archives later confirmed to Torres that the survey should have generated substantial documentation, but none appeared in the expected locations within the archive system. Mark Vickers, the graduate student who'd first recorded the anomalous coordinates, included a brief mention of the incident in his master's thesis, submitted to the University of Nevada in 1982. The reference was vague, a footnote about GPS receiver errors during fieldwork. His thesis advisor suggested removing even this oblique mention, noting it was not relevant to the research questions of the thesis. Vickers complied. In 1984, a journalist named Patricia Green from the Las Vegas Review-Journal contacted several members of the survey teams while researching a story about GPS technology deployment in civilian applications. She'd heard rumors about unusual readings during early field tests. Dr. Kowalski declined to be interviewed. Dr. O'Brien spoke with Green, but refused to provide specific details, saying only that early GPS receivers were unreliable in ways that weren't always documented. Linda Abernathy didn't respond to interview requests. David Sanchez, who'd left geological work to teach high school science in Utah, told Green he didn't remember anything unusual about the Pahranagat survey. Green's article, published in June of 1984, made no mention of the coordinate anomaly. The GPS receivers used in the 1979 survey were retired from service in the mid-1980s as newer, more accurate models became available. Equipment disposal records show the units were sent to a government surplus facility in 1986. No documentation exists about their final disposition. The Pahranagat Valley continues to support ranching and wildlife conservation. The area 12 miles north of Alamo, beneath which 3 GPS receivers once indicated a phantom location, has never been excavated or drilled. Bureau of Land Management maps show it as undifferentiated public land. Geological survey data from the region, when available, shows standard desert alluvium and sedimentary layers extending well below 400 feet. Nothing anomalous, nothing that would explain why 3 pieces of government equipment independently identified the same coordinates that corresponded to no physical feature anyone had documented. Dr. Frank Kowalski retired from geological work in 1997. In a private conversation recorded by a former student in 2003, Kowalski mentioned the Pahranagat survey only once. He said the coordinates had stayed with him, that he'd occasionally plot them on newer maps out of curiosity. The location remained empty. No structures, no drilling operations, no explanation. He said he'd learned not to look for answers to questions that had been officially forgotten. But he kept a copy of those coordinates in his personal files. Latitude, longitude, and depth. Numbers that 3 devices had agreed upon. Numbers that pointed 400 feet beneath Nevada desert to something that instruments could see, but no archive would acknowledge. Numbers written down, then erased, then remembered anyway in the careful notations of people who'd learned that some measurements are meant to disappear. There are roads that measure themselves differently than maps suggest, and along State Route 375 in Nevada, distance has never been a reliable constant. State Route 375 runs through Lincoln County in south-central Nevada, a stretch of two-lane blacktop that crosses 157 miles of high desert between the towns of Tonopah and Warm Springs. The road was originally designated State Route 25 when it was paved in 1947, serving ranchers and miners in one of the most remote regions of the continental United States. In 1996, the Nevada State Legislature officially renamed it the Extraterrestrial Highway, acknowledging the road's proximity to the Nevada Test and Training Range, better known by its designation within that range, Area 51. The nickname predated the official designation by decades, rooted in persistent reports of unusual aerial phenomena observed along the highway since the 1950s. The landscape surrounding Route 375 is classic basin and range topology, parallel mountain ranges running north to south, separated by broad valleys. The Groom Range lies to the south, largely encompassing the restricted military zone. To the north, the Timpahute and Worthington Ranges frame the horizon. Between these mountains, the valley floor sits at roughly 4,700 feet elevation, covered in sagebrush, rabbitbrush, and creosote. The nearest town of any size is Rachel, population 54, as of the 2020 census, located roughly at the highway's midpoint. The phenomenon predates the road's UFO associations by at least a decade. The first documented report came from a truck driver named Walter Hannigan in June of 1963. Hannigan was hauling mining equipment from Tonopah to the Timpahute Mining District east of the highway. When he noticed his odometer behaving strangely along a section of Route 25 between mile markers 32 and 44. According to his statement to the Nevada Highway Patrol, filed at the Tonopah station on June 18th, he'd reset his trip odometer at the junction with Highway 6 to track his distance. When he reached what his map indicated should be mile marker 44, a distance of 12 miles, his trip odometer showed only 3.2 miles had passed. Hannigan had been driving professionally for 16 years and maintained his vehicle meticulously. He stopped at the next town and had a mechanic examine his truck's odometer cable and speedometer. Both were functioning normally. The mechanic, whose name appears in the patrol report as Emil Korhonen, noted that the odometer advanced correctly during a test drive around town. Hannigan completed his delivery, but filed the report because, as he stated, something wasn't right with that stretch of road. The Highway Patrol noted the report but took no action. Odometer malfunctions were common enough, particularly in older vehicles traversing rough terrain. The report was filed in the Tonopah station's records and forgotten. Similar reports began accumulating through the 1960s and 70s, though none were systematically tracked until Highway Patrol Sergeant Dennis Kowalski began compiling them in 1982. Kowalski had been stationed in Tonopah since 1979 and had heard enough anecdotal accounts from local residents to become curious. He began requesting copies of any Highway Patrol reports mentioning odometer discrepancies along Route 375. By 1985, Kowalski had collected 14 separate reports spanning 2 decades. The reports shared common features. They all involved the same 12-mile section of highway between approximate mile markers 32 and 44, and they all described odometer readings that didn't match the known distance. What varied was the direction of the discrepancy. 7 reports described distances measuring shorter than expected, ranging from 3 to 9 miles instead of 12. 7 reports described distances measuring longer, anywhere from 15 to 27 miles for the same stretch of road. Kowalski's documentation, maintained in personal files separate from official Highway Patrol records, included statements from truck drivers, ranchers, tourists, and military contractors who worked at the Tonopah test range to the west. None of the witnesses knew each other. None appeared to have any reason to fabricate their accounts. They simply reported what their odometers had shown. Among the more detailed accounts was one from Barbara Jennings, a geological surveyor from Reno who'd been conducting field work in the area in April of 1983. Jennings had been trained to maintain precise distance measurements for her work and habitually monitored her odometer when traveling between survey sites. On April 23rd, she drove north on Route 375 from the Highway 6 junction. Her odometer, which she'd just had calibrated the previous week, showed only 4.6 miles when she reached the boundary of Rachel, a distance her maps indicated should be 12 miles. She made a note of it, but assumed her odometer had malfunctioned. When she returned south along the same route 3 days later, her odometer showed 19.3 miles for what should have been the same 12-mile distance. She stopped in Tonopah and had her odometer checked at 2 different service stations. Both confirmed it was working properly. She filed no official report but mentioned the experience to colleagues, one of whom eventually contacted Sergeant Kowalski. Jennings agreed to be interviewed by Kowalski in September of 1985. In her statement, she described feeling disoriented during both drives, though she attributed this to fatigue and the hypnotic quality of long desert highways. She noted that the landscape appeared the same in both directions, the same rock formations, the same distant mountains, but the odometer insisted different distances had been covered. She declined to speculate about causes, but stated she now avoided that section of highway when possible. A more troubling account came from Robert Yamada, a civilian contractor who worked at the Tonopah test range and commuted along Route 375 regularly. In March of 1984, Yamada and his colleague, engineer Patricia O'Malley, were driving north toward Rachel when both of them noticed their odometers behaving erratically. Yamada was driving and O'Malley was following in a separate vehicle approximately a quarter mile behind. According to statements both provided to Kowalski, Yamada's odometer advanced 23 miles during the 12-mile stretch, while O'Malley's showed only 5 miles for the same section of road. When they reached Rachel and compared notes, they were disturbed not by the discrepancies themselves, but by the fact that they'd been watching each other's vehicles the entire time. O'Malley had kept Yamada's taillights in view continuously. The distance between them had remained constant. They'd driven the same road at the same time, maintaining visual contact, yet their odometers had recorded distances that differed by 18 miles. Both had their vehicles examined. Both odometers were functioning normally. Neither filed an official report, but Yamada mentioned it to Kowalski during a chance encounter at a gas station in Tonopah months later. Kowalski attempted to interest the Nevada Department of Transportation in investigating the phenomenon in 1986. He submitted his compiled documentation to the district office, along with a request for surveying equipment to measure the actual distance of the affected highway section. His request was acknowledged but not approved. A supervisor told him informally that the road had been surveyed multiple times during construction and maintenance, and that official measurements confirmed the distance as 12.1 miles between the markers in question. Kowalski persisted. He measured the distance himself using a surveyor's wheel in August of 1986. Walking the shoulder of Route 375 from marker 32 to marker 44, he confirmed the distance as 12.08 miles. The physical road matched the maps. Whatever was affecting odometers wasn't altering the road itself. In 1987, Kowalski contacted Dr. Francis Delgado, a physicist at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, who'd published papers on spatial perception and measurement. Delgado was intrigued enough to visit the site in October of that year. He and a graduate assistant, Michael Torres, drove the section multiple times while monitoring multiple instruments, 2 separate vehicle odometers, a bicycle odometer attached to one of the vehicles, a GPS unit, still relatively rare in civilian use at that time, and a stopwatch to calculate distance based on speed and time. Their results, summarized in Delgado's notes, dated October 24th. 1987 were inconsistent. During 6 passes, 3 northbound, 3 southbound, all instruments agreed on 5 occasions, showing distances between 11.9 and 12.3 miles. On the 6th pass, southbound at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, both vehicle odometers showed 17.4 miles, while the GPS unit showed 12.1 miles, and the time-based calculation indicated 12 miles at their measured speed. Delgado could offer no explanation. In his notes, he wrote that the GPS reading suggested the vehicles had actually traveled 12 miles regardless of what the odometers indicated. But he acknowledged this didn't explain why mechanical instruments, odometers measuring wheel rotations, would show a different distance. He planned to return with additional equipment, but never did. When contacted by a journalist in 1992, Delgado said he'd become involved in other research and had not pursued the matter further. The Nevada Department of Transportation repaved the affected section of Route 375 in 1993, then again in 2003, 2010, and 2018. The repaving has never altered the pattern of reports. Sergeant Kowalski retired from the Highway Patrol in 2001. His personal files on the phenomenon, which he donated to the Nevada State Library and Archives, contained 41 separate documented accounts spanning nearly 4 decades. The most recent report in those files dates from July of 1999. A family traveling from California to Colorado described covering the section in what their minivan's digital odometer recorded as 4.2 miles. Their teenage daughter had been tracking the journey on a paper map and insisted they'd missed their intended turn at Rachel. When they backtracked and drove the same section again, the odometer showed 13.8 miles. The father, whose name is redacted in the archived report, wrote that they stopped counting after that. Route 375 remains open and well-maintained. Approximately 500 vehicles travel it daily, most without incident. The mile markers stand where they've always stood, spaced at intervals confirmed by multiple surveys. The landscape hasn't changed, the same sagebrush, the same distant mountains, the same unobstructed views for miles in every direction. But ask the mechanics in Tonopah about odometer problems on Route 375, and some of them will tell you they've seen it. Vehicles that come in after driving that stretch, odometers showing impossible readings, everything else functioning perfectly. They reset the trip meter, run diagnostics, find nothing wrong. The customers drive away, and most of them don't come back. Most of them probably assume it was a glitch, a momentary malfunction that corrected itself. Some of them, though, remember the feeling of driving that road, the peculiar sense that the landmarks weren't passing at the right speed, that the mountains weren't getting closer or farther at the rate they should. The feeling that distance itself had become negotiable, that the space between mile marker 32 and mile marker 44 contained something other than 12 miles of Nevada desert. And those are the ones who, if they drive Route 375 again, don't look at their odometers anymore. They just drive and trust that the road will eventually deliver them to wherever they're going, however many miles it decides that should be. Some cavities in the earth move air in patterns that shouldn't exist. And in the summer of 2001, a mine shaft near Austin, Nevada, began breathing like something alive. Austin sits in Lander County, roughly in the geographic center of Nevada, a town that peaked at 10,000 residents during the 1860s, silver boom, and now holds fewer than 200. The Reese River Valley stretches below the town, flanked by the Toyabe Range to the east and the Shoshone Range to the west. The mountains are honeycombed with mine shafts, hundreds of them, most dating from the 1860s through the 1890s, when silver was extracted in quantities that briefly made Austin one of the wealthiest towns in the American West. By the late 20th century, nearly all the mines had been abandoned. Some entrances had collapsed naturally. Others had been sealed by the Bureau of Land Management in the 1970s and 80s as part of hazardous site remediation efforts. But many remained open, accessible to the occasional mining historian, geologist, or recreational caver willing to navigate the rough terrain and obtain the necessary permits. The Merkur Mine, located approximately 8 miles northeast of Austin at an elevation of 7,200 feet, was one of these accessible sites. The mine had operated from 1864 to 1891, extracting moderate amounts of silver ore from a vertical shaft that descended roughly 300 feet before branching into lateral drifts. The mine had been worked intermittently until its final closure, at which point the equipment was removed and the site abandoned. Unlike many contemporaneous mines, the Merkur had never experienced fatal accidents or significant structural failures. It appeared in BLM documentation as stable but inactive, with a recommendation that cavers exercise standard underground precautions. On July 7, 2001, 3 members of the Northern Nevada Grotto, a chapter of the National Speleological Society, received permission from the BLM to survey and document the Merkur Mine. The team consisted of Dr. Janet Holbrook, a geology professor at the University of Nevada, Marcus Reeves, an experienced caver and cave rescue technician, and Lisa Tanaka, a graduate student in earth sciences. They planned a weekend expedition to map the mine's accessible passages and assess its historical features. They arrived at the mine site on the afternoon of July 7th. The entrance, a roughly circular opening approximately 6 feet in diameter, was partially obscured by sagebrush and showed evidence of occasional animal activity. Small bones, scat, the kinds of traces one would expect near any cave entrance in the region. Holbrook's field notes describe the site as unremarkable, consistent with typical abandoned hard rock mine of the period. The team entered the mine at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon. They descended the main shaft using standard caving techniques, fixed ropes, harnesses, helmets with mounted lights. The shaft was dry, the walls relatively stable, showing the characteristic hand-drilled holes and rough surfaces of 19th century mining. At a depth of approximately 180 feet, the shaft opened into a junction chamber where 3 lateral passages extended into the mountain. It was in this chamber, according to Holbrook's documentation, that they first noticed the air movement. Caves and mines typically exhibit airflow due to pressure differentials, temperature variations, and the stack effect, warm air rising and cool air sinking. Experienced cavers become attuned to these patterns. What Holbrook's team noticed was different. The air in the junction chamber was moving in rhythmic pulses, a distinct inflow lasting approximately 4 seconds, followed by an outflow lasting approximately 6 seconds. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision. Reeves, who'd been caving for 20 years, had never encountered airflow with such regular intervals. He spent several minutes observing it, holding a lighter flame near one of the lateral passages to visualize the movement. The flame bent inward during the 4-second cycle, then outward during the 6-second cycle, then repeated. He timed it with his watch over a 10-minute period. The pattern never varied by more than a fraction of a second. Holbrook hypothesized it might be related to a natural chimney effect or an undiscovered connection to the surface, creating a siphon. They decided to explore the lateral passages to locate the source of the airflow. Tanaka remained in the junction chamber with recording equipment, a digital voice recorder, a handheld anemometer to measure wind speed, and a barometer to track pressure changes. Holbrook and Reeves explored the rightmost lateral passage, which extended approximately 200 feet before terminating in a collapsed section. They found no openings, no evidence of connections to other passages or to the surface. When they returned to the junction chamber 40 minutes later, Tanaka reported that the breathing pattern had continued without variation the entire time they'd been gone. The team documented the phenomenon for another hour. Tanaka's anemometer readings showed air velocity fluctuating between 0.6 and 1.2 meters per second, gentle but measurable. The barometric readings showed corresponding micro-variations in pressure. The voice recorder captured the subtle sound of air moving through the passages, a soft whisper that rose and fell in the same 4/6 rhythm. They had planned to complete their survey and camp at the surface, but the unusual airflow compelled them to extend their underground time. They remained in the mine until approximately 7:30 that evening, by which point they'd recorded 3 hours of continuous respiratory pattern airflow. When they finally ascended to the surface, Holbrook decided they would return the following morning to continue documentation. They returned at 9 o'clock on July 8th. The breathing was still occurring, unchanged. Holbrook set up a more sophisticated monitoring station in the junction chamber, a laptop connected to a digital barometer capable of recording pressure changes at 1-second intervals, along with a tripod-mounted video camera aimed at a lighter flame to provide visual documentation of the airflow. The team spent most of July 8th exploring the other 2 lateral passages, searching for any geological feature that might explain the rhythmic air movement. They found nothing unusual. The passages were typical of the era's mining techniques, extending into the mountain, following silver-bearing veins until the ore quality diminished. Neither passage connected to any other known mine system or to the surface. The monitoring equipment ran continuously. When they reviewed the data that evening at their campsite, the barometric readings showed 72 consecutive hours of 4/6 breathing cycles, beginning sometime before they'd first entered the mine on July 7th. The pattern had not deviated. The video footage showed the lighter flame responding to each cycle with identical movements, over and over, for hours. Holbrook contacted her department supervisor that evening via satellite phone. Cell coverage in the area was non-existent. She described the phenomenon and requested permission to extend the fieldwork for several additional days. Her supervisor, Dr. Raymond Kowalski, approved the extension, but suggested she also contact the BLM to report the unusual conditions. On July 9th, the team returned to the mine at dawn. The breathing had stopped. They descended to the junction chamber and found completely still air. No movement, no pressure variations, no sound except their own breathing and the ambient drip of groundwater. Holbrook checked her equipment. Everything was functioning properly. The barometer showed stable pressure. The video camera recorded a motionless flame. They remained underground for 6 hours, waiting for the pattern to resume. Nothing changed. By afternoon, they packed their equipment and prepared to leave. Before ascending, Reeves conducted a final check of the lateral passages. He reported nothing unusual, just empty mine tunnels and still air. They surfaced around 3 in the afternoon. Holbrook made notes about the cessation of airflow and began planning a return visit for late August to determine whether the phenomenon was seasonal or temperature dependent. They drove back to Austin that evening. Holbrook called Dr. Kowalski from the town's single payphone to report that the breathing had stopped. Kowalski acknowledged the information and asked her to submit a preliminary report when she returned to the university. On July 14th, Holbrook received a call from the BLM's Carson City office. A field officer informed her that the Merkur mine had been sealed due to instability concerns. When Holbrook asked for clarification, the mine had been stable during their survey. The officer stated only that a recent assessment had determined the site posed safety risks and that it had been closed to public access. Holbrook contacted Reeves and Tanaka. Both confirmed they'd received no prior notice about closure or instability concerns. Holbrook submitted a formal inquiry to the BLM requesting information about the assessment that had led to the closure. Her inquiry was acknowledged but not answered. On July 28th, Holbrook drove to the Merker mine site. The entrance had been sealed with concrete. A metal plate bolted to the surrounding rock bore a BLM notice stating the mine was closed due to hazardous conditions, with citations to federal regulations regarding abandoned mine safety. The concrete appeared professionally poured, requiring significant equipment and materials. No tire tracks or equipment traces remained in the area. Holbrook photographed the sealed entrance and returned to Austin. She stopped at the BLM field office and requested information about who had authorized and performed the closure work. The office staff could provide no immediate information, but said they would forward her inquiry to the district office. No response ever came. Dr. Kowalski reviewed Holbrook's preliminary report in August of 2001. The report included descriptions of the breathing pattern, barometric data, video footage, and documentation of the subsequent closure. Kowalski filed the report in departmental archives and suggested to Holbrook that she focus her research on more conventional geological topics. Holbrook attempted to publish a paper about the phenomenon in 2003. The paper, submitted to the Journal of Cave and Karst Studies, was rejected. One reviewer noted that while the documentation appeared thorough, the phenomenon as described lacked any plausible geological mechanism, and that without access to the site for peer verification, publication was not warranted. Marcus Reeves mentioned the Merker mine incident during a cave rescue training seminar in 2005. Several attendees expressed interest, and one, a geologist named Patricia O'Malley, who worked for a mining consultant, asked for the specific location. When O'Malley visited the site later that year, she found the entrance still sealed. She contacted the BLM to request information about the closure, but received a response stating only that the mine had been sealed in accordance with standard protocols. Lisa Tanaka completed her graduate degree in 2004 and left academic geology to work in environmental consulting. In a private conversation recorded by a former classmate in 2009, she mentioned that she still had copies of the audio recordings from the Merker mine, 3 hours of rhythmic air movement that sounded, she said, exactly like someone breathing in the dark. The recordings exist in Tanaka's personal files, but have never been publicly released. She declined interview requests in 2012 and 2018, stating only that the incident was documented in Holbrook's report and that she had nothing to add. Dr. Holbrook retired from the University of Nevada in 2019. Her research files, donated to the university archives, include the complete documentation from the July 2001 Merker Mine survey. The barometric data shows 72 hours of regular 4-6-second pressure variations. The video footage shows a lighter flame bending in rhythm to an invisible force. The written notes describe air moving through abandoned tunnels in patterns that matched, with precision, the respiratory rate of a resting human adult. The Merker mine remains sealed. The concrete has weathered, but shows no signs of deterioration. The metal warning plate has faded, but remains legible. The surrounding landscape has absorbed the closure. Sagebrush grows near the sealed entrance. Small animals leave tracks in the dust, and the Toyabe Range stands silent against the Nevada sky. But in university archives and in personal files kept by people who descended into that mountain in July of 2001, there exists documentation of 72 hours when something breathed in the darkness 300 feet underground, 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out, over and over, and then, for reasons no one has explained, it stopped. There are places where light behaves as though it's been waiting for someone specific, and in October of 2008, the ruins of Rhyolite wrote three names no one had spoken aloud. Rhyolite sits in Nye County, Nevada, approximately 4 miles west of Beatty, in the Bullfrog Hills at the edge of Death Valley. The town was founded in 1905 following the discovery of high-grade gold ore and grew rapidly to a population of nearly 5,000 by 1907. The boom was brief. By 1910, ore production had declined sharply. The last train left Rhyolite in 1916, and by 1920 the town was effectively abandoned. What remains are stone and concrete ruins, the three-story Cookbank building, the train depot, the bottle house, and scattered foundations where wooden structures once stood before the desert reclaimed them. The site became a tourist attraction in the latter half of the 20th century, preserved by the Bureau of Land Management as part of the Goldwell Open Air Museum. The ruins are accessible year-round, though visitor traffic is light outside of spring and fall when desert temperatures are moderate. The BLM maintains minimal infrastructure, a small parking area, informational plaques, and periodic patrols to prevent vandalism. No lighting exists at the site. After sunset, Rhyolite is illuminated only by moonlight and the distant glow of Beatty to the east. On October 12, 2008, 3 individuals arrived at Rhyolite shortly after sunset to photograph and film the ruins. They were part of an informal group interested in abandoned places, not paranormal investigators, but photographers and videographers drawn to architectural decay. The 3 were Michael Brennan, a freelance photographer from Las Vegas, Sarah Delgado, a graphic designer from Henderson, and Kevin O'Sullivan, a documentary filmmaker based in Reno. They'd coordinated their visit through an online forum dedicated to Nevada ghost towns and had never met in person before that evening. They arrived separately between 7:15 and 7:30 in the evening. The moon was in its waxing gibbous phase, providing enough ambient light for navigation but requiring supplemental lighting for photography. Each brought standard equipment, digital cameras, tripods, flashlights, and in O'Sullivan's case, a high-definition video camera with infrared capability for low-light filming. The group convened near the Cookbank building, the most intact structure in Rhyolite. The building's walls still stand to their full 3-story height, though the roof and interior floors have long since collapsed. Window openings frame empty sky. According to Brennan's written account, posted to the online forum 3 weeks after the visit, they spent approximately 30 minutes photographing the building's exterior before O'Sullivan suggested filming inside. The interior is accessible through several openings at ground level. The group entered through what had been the main entrance on the building's north side. Brennan went first, followed by Delgado, then O'Sullivan, who was operating his video camera. The camera's timestamp, visible in the footage, shows they entered at 8:03 in the evening. The interior of the Cookbank building is a hollow shell. Debris from the collapsed upper floors litters the ground. Broken beams, chunks of plaster, shattered glass. The walls retain traces of their original finish, though most surfaces have been scoured by wind and time. O'Sullivan's video shows the group navigating carefully around debris, their flashlights casting moving shadows against the walls. At 8:07, according to the timestamp, Delgado stopped walking and directed her flashlight at the eastern wall. In the video, her voice is heard asking if anyone else had brought additional lights. Both Brennan and O'Sullivan replied that they hadn't. Delgado stated that she'd seen a light on the wall that wasn't from any of their flashlights. O'Sullivan turned his camera toward the eastern wall. The video shows a section of deteriorating plaster, approximately 8 feet above ground level. For several seconds, nothing unusual is visible. Then, at 8:08 and 14 seconds, a point of light appears on the wall's surface. The light is small, perhaps the size of a coin, and emits a pale blue-white glow. It moves slowly across the wall, tracing a path that becomes recognizable after several seconds. It's writing something. The light forms a cursive letter S, a smooth, flowing script that takes approximately 6 seconds to complete. The letter remains visible for another 3 seconds, then fades. In the video, Delgado says, "That's my initial. That's an S." Her voice is steady but uncertain. Brennan asks if someone outside the building is projecting light through one of the window openings. O'Sullivan pans the camera to show all the windows. They're empty and no light source is visible from outside. The point of light appears again, this time several feet to the right of where the S had been. It traces another letter, an M, in the same cursive style. The movement is deliberate, unhurried. The letter M takes approximately 8 seconds to form, then holds for 3 seconds before fading. Brennan, whose first name is Michael, says quietly, "That's mine." The third letter appears shortly after, a K, positioned between where the S and M had been. The same blue-white light, the same cursive script, Kevin O'Sullivan's initial. The letter completes, holds, then fades like the others. O'Sullivan's video continues for another 6 minutes. The group remains mostly silent, watching the wall. Brennan suggests they leave the building. Delgado argues they should stay and document whether the phenomenon repeats. O'Sullivan continues filming but begins backing toward the entrance. At 8:14, approximately 6 minutes after the first letter appeared, they exit the building. Outside, they review the video footage on O'Sullivan's camera's small screen. The letters are clearly visible in the recording. O'Sullivan films himself holding his driver's license next to Brennan's and Delgado's to show their names. Kevin, Michael, Sarah, KMS. They decide to re-enter the building. O'Sullivan's video shows them returning to the same location inside at 8:21. They wait for 18 minutes. No lights appear. They systematically search the building for any equipment, projection devices, or evidence of other people. They find nothing. At 8:43, they leave Rhyolite entirely. The three met the following day in Las Vegas to review the footage on a larger screen. O'Sullivan made copies of the video file for Brennan and Delgado. All three posted accounts of the experience to the Urban Exploration Forum where they'd originally connected. The posts included still frames extracted from the video showing each of the three letters. Forum members offered various explanations: flashlight reflections, camera artifacts, deliberate hoax. O'Sullivan responded that the video was unedited and invited skeptical members to analyze the file. Several people with video editing and optical experience downloaded the footage and examined it. Among those who analyzed the video was Dr. Raymond Kowalski, a professor of optics at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Dr. Kowalski had a professional interest in light phenomena and had consulted on several documentary projects involving unusual optical effects. He reviewed O'Sullivan's video in late October of 2008. His analysis, shared privately with O'Sullivan and later posted to the forum with O'Sullivan's permission, confirmed several key points. The light source visible in the video did not match the spectral characteristics of any of the flashlights the group had been carrying. The movement of the light was smooth and continuous, inconsistent with someone attempting to write with a handheld light source, which would show minor tremors and variations. Most significantly, frame-by-frame analysis showed no corresponding beam or projection cone. The light appeared on the wall's surface without any visible path from a source. Dr. Kowalski stated in his analysis that he could identify no conventional explanation for the footage. He noted that the letters' formation suggested intelligence or intent. The cursive script was too consistent, too deliberate to be random. He recommended that O'Sullivan preserve the original file and metadata for potential further study. On November 7, 2008, O'Sullivan contacted Dr. Kowalski to report that the original video file had become corrupted. O'Sullivan maintained multiple backups on different hard drives, and the copies he'd given to Brennan and Delgado remained intact, but the master file, the one containing the full metadata and highest resolution, no longer opened properly. Attempts to repair the file were unsuccessful. The video content was still viewable in the backup copies, but technical information about the camera settings, timestamp accuracy, and file authenticity was lost. Dr. Kowalski suggested O'Sullivan send the corrupted file to a data recovery specialist. O'Sullivan did so, using a service recommended by the university's IT department. The specialist reported that the file showed signs of systematic data degradation but couldn't determine a cause. The specialist noted that the pattern of corruption was unusual. Most corrupted files show random errors, but O'Sullivan's file showed what the specialist described as selective degradation, as though specific portions of the file had been targeted. The working copies of the video remained online in various locations through 2009. In 2010, most of these copies were removed at O'Sullivan's request. He told forum members that he'd received inquiries from parties he declined to identify and preferred to limit the video's distribution. One low-resolution copy remains accessible through an archived version of the Urban Exploration Forum, though image quality is significantly reduced. Brennan returned to Rhyolite twice in 2009, both times with camera equipment. He documented his visits but reported no unusual phenomena. He stopped discussing the October 2008 incident publicly after 2011. Delgado moved to Portland, Oregon in 2012. In a private message to a forum member in 2014, she mentioned that she'd deleted all her personal copies of the Rhyolite video and preferred not to discuss the incident further. O'Sullivan continued working as a documentary filmmaker. He has not released any projects related to the Rhyolite footage. In a 2016 interview for an independent film blog, he was asked about the most unusual thing he'd ever filmed. He mentioned the Rhyolite video briefly, noted that he no longer had access to the original file, and said he'd learned to be more careful about what he chose to document. The Cook Bank building still stands in Rhyolite, its walls unchanged, its windows still empty frames against the Nevada sky. The Bureau of Land Management continues to maintain the site. Tour groups visit regularly during daylight hours. Occasional urban explorers arrive after dark, though BLM patrols discourage nighttime access. No subsequent reports of unusual lights in the Cook Bank building have been officially documented. Forum discussions of the 2008 incident have largely faded, replaced by more recent explorations and discoveries. The video remains difficult to find, and most people who encounter references to it assume it was fabricated or misinterpreted. But there exists in archived forum posts and in the memories of 3 people who stood in those ruins on an October night, documentation of something that wrote their names on a wall, letters formed by light that had no source, script that knew who was watching, initials traced in cursive on plaster that had been weathering for a century. Sarah, Michael, Kevin, S.M.K. 3 letters that appeared in sequence, not in alphabetical order, not in the order the 3 had entered the building, but in the order they'd been standing when the first light appeared. Sarah on the left, Kevin in the middle, Michael on the right. As though something in that hollow shell of a building had taken attendance, had known exactly who was present, and had chosen to announce that knowledge in script elegant enough to be a greeting or a warning. Though which of those it was, no one has ever been able to say. Some populations exist only on paper, and in the spring of 1950, 73 people in Winnemucca were counted but never found. Winnemucca sits in Humboldt County in north-central Nevada, roughly 165 miles northeast of Reno, along Interstate 80. The town was established in 1868 as a station along the Central Pacific Railroad and named after a northern Paiute chief who'd advocated for peaceful relations with white settlers. By the mid-20th century, Winnemucca served as a regional hub for ranching, mining, and railroad operations, with a population that fluctuated between 3,000 and 4,000 residents depending on economic conditions. The 1950 census was conducted across the United States between April 1st and April 30th of that year. Census takers went door to door, recording names, ages, occupations, and household compositions. In Winnemucca, the task fell to 3 local residents appointed as enumerators by the Census Bureau: Margaret Holbrook, a retired schoolteacher, Robert Yamada, a postal clerk, and Dennis Kowalski, a county clerk familiar with local records. The 1950 census records for Humboldt County were completed and submitted to the Census Bureau by May 15th. The documents were microfilmed in the 1960s and eventually digitized in the early 2000s, making them accessible to researchers and genealogists. It was during this digitization process that the first anomalies were noticed. In 2004, a genealogist named Patricia O'Malley was researching her family history in Humboldt County. While reviewing the 1950 census records for Winnemucca, she encountered a name she recognized from her grandmother's stories: Eleanor Vasquez, listed as a 42-year-old seamstress living on Malarkey Street. O'Malley's grandmother had mentioned a seamstress by that name who'd briefly worked in town, but family records suggested Eleanor Vasquez had actually lived in Elko, not Winnemucca. O'Malley attempted to verify the census entry by cross-referencing it with other records. She found no birth certificate for Eleanor Vasquez in Nevada State Archives, no property records in Humboldt County, no tax filings, and no death certificate in subsequent years. The only documentation of Eleanor Vasquez's existence was the single line in the 1950 census. Curious, O'Malley began checking other names from the same census pages. She found similar patterns, individuals listed with specific ages, occupations, and addresses, but no supporting documentation in any other archive. Over several weeks of research, she identified 17 such individuals. All appeared in the 1950 Winnemucca census. None appeared anywhere else. O'Malley contacted the Humboldt County Historical Society in August of 2004. She spoke with the Society's archivist, Linda Abernathy, and shared her findings. Abernathy was skeptical initially. Missing records were common, particularly from the early 20th century when documentation practices were less standardized. But O'Malley's research was thorough. She'd checked multiple archives, contacted county offices in surrounding areas, and found nothing. Abernathy agreed to conduct her own investigation. She assembled a team of 3 volunteers: retired librarian Janet Torres, local historian Michael Brennan, and genealogist David Sanchez, to systematically review the 1950 census records for Winnemucca. They worked through the fall of 2004, cross-referencing every name in the census against birth records, marriage licenses, property deeds, voter registrations, and newspaper archives. By December of 2004, they'd identified 73 individuals who appeared only in the census and nowhere else. The number was precise and troubling: 73 people scattered across different census enumeration districts within Winnemucca, all with detailed information: names, ages, occupations, household positions, but no existence outside that single document. The names were diverse. There were men and women, ranging in age from infants to elderly individuals. Some were listed as heads of household, others as spouses, children, or boarders. Occupations varied: miners, store clerks, ranch hands, housewives. Nothing obvious connected them except their absence from every other record. Abernathy's team documented their findings in a report submitted to the Nevada State Library and Archives in January of 2005. The report included a complete list of the 73 names, along with documentation showing the absence of corroborating records for each individual. The report raised questions about census methodology, record-keeping practices, and the possibility of clerical errors, but offered no definitive explanation. The state library acknowledged receipt of the report and forwarded it to the Nevada State Data Center, which handles census-related inquiries. A response came in March of 2005, stating that census records from 1950 were considered reliable and that gaps in supporting documentation likely reflected incomplete record retention rather than census errors. The response noted that many rural Nevada records from that era had been lost to fires, floods, or simple neglect. This explanation satisfied no one on Abernathy's team. While it was true that records could be lost, the complete absence of any documentation for 73 specific individuals seemed improbable. Birth certificates, in particular, were state-level documents stored in Carson City, not local records vulnerable to county-level losses. Yet not one of the 73 individuals had a Nevada birth certificate on file. Michael Brennan, the local historian, proposed a different line of inquiry. He suggested checking census records from other Nevada towns to see if similar patterns existed. If the 73 ghost names were a Winnemucca-specific phenomenon, that might suggest local factors. Perhaps a specific census taker had fabricated entries to inflate population counts, or records had been deliberately altered for political or economic reasons. The team expanded their research through 2005 and 2006, reviewing digitized census records from other Nevada communities. What they found was more disturbing than a localized anomaly. In the 1940 census for Elko, they found 73 individuals with no supporting documentation. Different names than those in Winnemucca, but the same precise count. In the 1930 census for Ely, 73 undocumented individuals. In the 1960 census for Fallon, 73 more. The pattern extended across decades and across Nevada. Different towns, different years, but always exactly 73 names that existed only in census records. David Sanchez compiled the data into a comprehensive chart. Between 1920 and 1970, across 8 different Nevada towns, census records contained 584 individuals, 8 groups of 73, who had no birth certificates, no property records, no tax documents, no marriage licenses, no death certificates, and no mentions in newspapers. They existed solely as entries in decennial census counts. More unsettling was what Sanchez discovered when he compared the names across different towns and decades. Some names appeared multiple times. Eleanor Vasquez, the seamstress O'Malley had originally researched, appeared in both the 1950 Winnemucca census and the 1930 Ely census, listed with different ages and occupations, but the same name. 16 other names appeared in at least 2 separate census counts in different Nevada towns decades apart. The Historical Society presented these findings at a Nevada Historical Society conference in Reno in October of 2006. The presentation generated significant discussion but little resolution. Census Bureau representatives in attendance suggested the pattern might reflect data entry errors during the digitization process. Perhaps a corrupted database had introduced duplicate or fictional entries. But when the team examined original microfilm records, the names were there too, recorded in the same handwriting and format as legitimate entries. Dr. Raymond Kowalski, a demographer from the University of Nevada, Reno, attended the presentation and requested copies of the data. He conducted his own analysis through late 2006 and early 2007. His findings, published in an academic paper in 2007, confirmed the team's work but offered no explanation. Dr. Kowalski noted that the number 73 had no obvious demographic significance. It didn't correspond to any standard sampling methodology or statistical convention used by the Census Bureau. He proposed several hypotheses. One possibility was that census takers had been required to meet minimum enumeration quotas and had invented individuals to reach those targets. But this didn't explain why the number was always 73, or why some names recurred across different locations and decades. Another possibility was that the individuals were real but had lived off-grid, transient workers, undocumented immigrants, or people deliberately avoiding official records. But this didn't explain the complete absence of birth certificates, even for individuals listed as Nevada-born. Dr. Kowalski's paper attracted modest attention in demographic and genealogical circles, but generated no institutional investigation. The Census Bureau, when contacted by journalists following the paper's publication, stated that historical census records could contain errors, and that without access to original enumerator notes, most of which had been destroyed decades earlier, it was impossible to verify specific entries from 70 years prior. Patricia O'Malley, whose initial research had sparked the investigation, continued searching for Eleanor Vasquez through 2008. She expanded her search beyond Nevada, checking records in California, Oregon, Utah, and Arizona. She found nothing. Eleanor Vasquez existed in two census records, Ely in 1930 and Winnemucca in 1950, and nowhere else in documented American history. In 2009, Janet Torres discovered something that deepened the mystery. While reviewing 1950 census records for Winnemucca, she noticed that several of the 73 undocumented individuals were listed at addresses that didn't exist. The census listed them as residents of buildings on streets that had never been constructed, or at house numbers beyond the actual range of developed lots. When Torres checked historical maps and property records, these addresses had no corresponding structures in 1950 or any other year. Linda Abernathy compiled a final report in 2010, summarizing 6 years of research. The report documented 584 individuals across 8 Nevada towns whose only existence was in census records. It noted the recurring number 73, the repeated names across decades, and the phantom addresses. The report concluded with a simple statement: these individuals were counted but never lived, or lived in a way that left no trace except for a single moment every 10 years when census takers knocked on doors that might not have existed and recorded names that might never have been spoken. The report was archived with the Nevada Historical Society and the State Library. No official investigation followed. No Census Bureau inquiry was launched. The names remain in the historical record, accessible to anyone who searches digitized census data and indistinguishable from legitimate entries except for their singular existence. The pattern has not been found in census records after 1970. Whether this reflects improved record-keeping, changes in census methodology, or simply the end of whatever produced those 73 names in each decade remains unclear. Winnemucca continues as it always has. A railroad town in the high desert, its population counted every 10 years, its residents documented and verified. The census forms from 1950 are stored on microfilm in climate-controlled archives, the names recorded in careful handwriting, including Eleanor Vasquez, seamstress, age 42, Malarkey Street. A woman who existed long enough to be counted, then vanished so completely that no evidence of her birth, life, or death remains anywhere except in that single line of text. And somewhere in those same archives, in other towns and other decades, 73 more names in each, always 73, waiting in their phantom addresses, their invented occupations, their impossible ages, as though census takers in the Nevada desert had been instructed to count not just the living, but something else as well. Something that appeared every 10 years, precisely numbered, leaving only names and nothing more. There are places where time moves differently than clocks suggest, and on a September afternoon in 2003, Walker Lake erased 40 minutes from the lives of everyone who could see its water. Walker Lake sits in Mineral County in western Nevada, roughly 70 miles southeast of Reno. The lake is a remnant of ancient Lake Lahontan, the massive inland sea that covered much of the Great Basin during the last ice age. Today, Walker Lake stretches approximately 18 miles north to south and 7 miles east to west, fed primarily by the Walker River flowing from the Sierra Nevada. The lake has no outlet, and decades of agricultural diversion have caused water levels to drop steadily, increasing salinity and threatening the ecosystem. The small community of Hawthorne sits at the lake's southwestern shore, established in 1926 to support the U.S. Army Ammunition Depot that still operates there. The lake's shores are sparsely populated. A few dozen homes dot the shoreline, occupied primarily by retirees, military personnel stationed at the depot, and families who've lived in the area for generations. The terrain is high desert, sagebrush, volcanic rock, and mountains rising to the west. Cell phone coverage is limited. The nearest significant town is Yerington, 30 miles north. On September 14, 2003, a Sunday afternoon, temperatures at Walker Lake reached the mid-80s. Most residents were indoors or on their porches, taking advantage of the mild weather before autumn set in. Traffic was light on Highway 95, which runs along the lake's eastern shore. At approximately 3:17 p.m., every timekeeping device within visual range of Walker Lake jumped forward by 40 minutes. The first person to notice was Margaret Kowalski, a 68-year-old retired nurse who lived in a house overlooking the lake's western shore. She'd been sitting on her porch reading when she glanced at her wristwatch to check the time. The watch showed 3:57 p.m. She was certain it had been around 3:15 just moments before. She walked inside and checked the clock on her microwave. 3:57. The clock on her cable box showed the same time. Her battery-powered wall clock in the kitchen also read 3:57. Kowalski assumed there had been a power outage that reset her digital clocks, though that wouldn't explain her mechanical wristwatch. She called her neighbor, Linda Vasquez, who lived 3 houses down the shore. Vasquez answered and immediately mentioned that her clocks had jumped forward. She'd been watching television when the cable signal briefly pixelated, and when it stabilized, the on-screen clock display showed a time 40 minutes later than what she remembered. Both women called other neighbors. Within 30 minutes, they'd confirmed that at least 9 households along the western shore had experienced the same phenomenon. Every clock, every watch, every phone, all had jumped from approximately 3:17 p.m. to 3:57 p.m. No one recalled losing consciousness or experiencing any gap in awareness. They simply looked at their timepieces and discovered 40 minutes had passed without passing. Robert Yamada, a civilian contractor who worked at the Hawthorne Army Depot, was driving north on Highway 95 when his truck's digital clock jumped forward. He was listening to a radio program and noticed that the program's content didn't match what should have been airing at 3:57. He pulled over at a gas station in Hawthorne and asked the attendant what time it was. The attendant checked his phone and said 3:22. Yamada showed him his truck's clock, which read 3:57. The attendant's clock hadn't changed. Yamada drove back toward his house on the western shore. As he approached the lake and gained a clear view of the water, his phone, which had been showing 3:23, suddenly jumped to 3:58. He watched it happen. The display flickered briefly, then showed the new time. He pulled over again and called his wife, who was at their home in Hawthorne, away from direct line of sight to the lake. Her clocks all showed 3:24. His phone showed 3:58. By late afternoon, residents were comparing experiences. A pattern emerged. Everyone who had been within direct visual range of Walker Lake between 3:15 and 3:20 p.m. had experienced the time jump. This included people in homes along the shore, people in vehicles on highway sections where the lake was visible, and 2 fishermen who'd been on the lake itself in a small boat. All their timepieces, mechanical watches, digital clocks, battery-powered devices, even an analog clock in one home, had jumped forward by approximately 40 minutes. People who had been inland, even just a few miles from the lake, experienced no disruption. Their clocks remained synchronized with national time standards. The boundary appeared to be visual. If you could see the lake's water, your time changed. If you couldn't, it didn't. Patricia O'Brien, a physics teacher from Hawthorne, was among those affected. She'd been sitting in her car in a parking area along Highway 95 grading papers when her phone and car clock both jumped forward. O'Brien was familiar with relativity and time dilation concepts, but nothing in her education explained localized temporal displacement affecting mechanical devices. She began documenting witness accounts, collecting information about exactly where people had been and what timepieces they'd been using. By the evening of September 14th, O'Brien had compiled statements from 17 individuals. Their accounts were consistent. The time jump had occurred at 3:17 p.m. plus or minus 2 minutes, depending on when people checked their devices. The displacement was 40 minutes in every case. No one reported physical symptoms. No dizziness, no disorientation, no memory gaps. They simply existed in one moment, then discovered they were 40 minutes ahead of everyone else. O'Brien contacted the Mineral County Sheriff's Office that evening. Deputy Frank Morrison took her call and initially suggested the problem was likely related to the recent adjustment of daylight saving time. O'Brien explained that daylight saving time hadn't changed in September and that the displacement was 40 minutes, not an hour. Morrison said he'd file a report, but wasn't sure what agency would handle such a complaint. O'Brien also contacted the Navy's Fallon Naval Air Station, approximately 50 miles north, wondering if military operations might have involved electromagnetic pulses or other phenomena that could affect electronics. The Public Affairs Office responded 2 days later with a statement that no operations had been conducted in the Walker Lake area on September 14th, and that naval exercises were conducted far from civilian population centers. On September 16th, O'Brien drove to Reno and met with Dr. Michael Torres, a physicist at the University of Nevada. She brought documentation of the witness accounts and her own affected devices, a wristwatch and cell phone, both showing times 40 minutes ahead of the university's synchronized clocks. Dr. Torres examined the devices and confirmed they were functioning normally but displaying incorrect times. O'Brien reset them to match standard time in his presence. Dr. Torres was skeptical of the reported cause, but intrigued enough to visit Walker Lake himself on September 19th. He brought timing equipment synchronized to GPS satellites, along with cameras and electromagnetic field detectors. He positioned himself at one of the locations where witnesses had reported experiencing the time jump and waited for several hours. Nothing unusual occurred. His equipment remained synchronized with GPS time throughout. He interviewed several witnesses, including Margaret Kowalski, Linda Vasquez, and Robert Yamada. Their accounts remained consistent with what O'Brien had documented. Dr. Torres noted in his field report that the witnesses appeared credible and showed no signs of coordinating a hoax. He could offer no explanation for the reported phenomenon, but acknowledged that the consistency of the accounts was difficult to dismiss as mass misperception. Dr. Torres submitted his findings to the physics department as an informal report. He recommended that if the phenomenon occurred again, more comprehensive monitoring should be conducted. He noted that the reported boundary based on visual line of sight to the lake was particularly unusual, as electromagnetic effects wouldn't be limited by visual range, and gravitational effects strong enough to cause measurable time dilation would have other observable consequences. No institutional investigation followed. The Navy confirmed no operations in the area. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, which maintains atomic clock networks, reported no anomalies in GPS or time signal transmissions for September 14th. The U.S. Geological Survey confirmed no seismic activity at Walker Lake on that date. The Federal Communications Commission received no reports of radio frequency interference. Patricia O'Brien continued documenting the incident through the fall of 2003. She expanded her witness list to 23 individuals and created a map showing their locations at 3:17 p.m. on September 14th. The affected area formed a rough crescent along the western and southern shores of Walker Lake, encompassing approximately 8 miles of shoreline and extending inland only as far as the lake remained visible. She attempted to interest journalists in the story. A reporter from the Reno Gazette-Journal interviewed her in October, but the resulting article was brief and treated the incident as a curiosity rather than a serious anomaly. The article mentioned clock synchronization errors and suggested the witnesses might have experienced a localized power surge that affected electronic devices. It didn't explain the mechanical watches or the precise 40-minute displacement. O'Brien published a self-printed booklet in 2004 titled The Walker Lake Time Anomaly, a documentary investigation. She distributed copies to physics departments at several Western universities and to media outlets in Nevada. The booklet received minimal attention. One physics professor at UCLA wrote back suggesting the phenomenon might have been related to GPS signal glitches, though he acknowledged this didn't explain mechanical timepieces. In 2006, O'Brien organized a gathering at Walker Lake on September 14th, the third anniversary of the incident. 8 of the original witnesses attended, along with O'Brien and a few curiosity seekers who'd read about the event online. They positioned themselves at various points along the shore where the time jump had been reported. Nothing unusual occurred. At 3:17 p.m., all timepieces remained synchronized. The gathering became an annual event for several years, though attendance dwindled. By 2010, only O'Brien and 2 others showed up. The phenomenon did not repeat. Margaret Kowalski passed away in 2011. Her obituary in the Mineral County Independent made no mention of the time anomaly. Robert Yamada moved away from Walker Lake in 2013, relocating to Carson City for work. In a brief phone interview with a podcast producer in 2015, he confirmed that the incident had occurred as he'd reported, but said he'd stopped thinking about it years ago. It had happened, he couldn't explain it, and life had moved on. Linda Vasquez still lives along Walker Lake's western shore. She keeps the same wristwatch she wore on September 14, 2003, though she had it serviced in 2007, and the watchmaker found nothing unusual about its mechanism. She occasionally mentions the incident to visitors, but doesn't dwell on it. 40 minutes vanished from her afternoon 16 years ago. Her watch jumped forward, her clocks reset themselves, and then everything continued as though time had never broken its rhythm. Patricia O'Brien retired from teaching in 2018. Her documentation of the Walker Lake incident remains archived at the Mineral County Library. 23 witness statements, photographs of affected devices, maps showing the boundary of the anomaly, and her correspondence with scientists and journalists who found the incident interesting but ultimately unexplainable. Walker Lake continues its slow decline, water levels dropping, salinity increasing, the shoreline receding year by year. The houses where witnesses lived are still there, occupied by the same families or new residents who've never heard about September 14, 2003. Highway 95 still runs along the eastern shore, and occasionally drivers pull over to photograph the lake, its stark beauty framed by desert mountains. And somewhere in the physics of that place, in the relationship between the lake's water and the devices that measure time, in whatever property of space or geology or something unnamed that exists along those 8 miles of shoreline, there remains the possibility that it could happen again. that someone could glance at their watch while looking at Walker Lake and discover they're 40 minutes ahead of the rest of the world, having lived through time they don't remember losing, carried forward by a clock that jumped without explanation and now ticks onward as though nothing had ever been wrong. Some sounds return from the stone carrying more than what was sent. And in Cathedral Gorge, the walls have been finishing people's sentences for 50 years. Cathedral Gorge State Park sits in Lincoln County in southeastern Nevada, approximately 2 miles north of the small community of Panaca. The park encompasses approximately 1,600 acres of eroded bentonite clay formations, spires, slots, and caves carved over millennia by wind and rain. The bentonite originated from volcanic ash that settled in ancient lakes millions of years ago. As erosion exposed and shaped the deposits, they formed narrow canyons with walls rising up to 160 feet. The color ranges from cream to gray to rust brown, and the acoustic properties of the formations are exceptional. A whisper in certain canyons can be heard clearly 100 yards away. The area was known to indigenous peoples for thousands of years before white settlement. The southern Paiute people traveled through the region seasonally, and oral traditions mention the gorges as places of spiritual significance. Mormon settlers arrived in the 1860s, establishing Panaca as one of Nevada's earliest permanent settlements. The unusual geological formations drew visitors, and the area was designated a state park in 1935. By the mid-20th century, Cathedral Gorge had become a modest but steady tourist destination. Families came to photograph the formations, hike the trails, and test the acoustics. The echo effect was part of the park's appeal. Visitors would shout into the canyons and listen as their voices bounced back, sometimes repeating 4 or 5 times before fading. The first documented report of anomalous echoes came from a park ranger named Walter Hannigan in June of 1973. Hannigan had been conducting a trail inspection in one of the narrower slot canyons when he heard voices. He assumed other visitors were nearby, but when he called out asking if anyone needed assistance, the echo that returned included words he hadn't spoken. According to his incident report, filed with the Nevada Division of State Parks on June 19th, he'd shouted, "Anyone there?" And the echo came back as, "Anyone there who needs help?" Hannigan assumed he'd misheard or that another person had responded. He searched the canyon thoroughly but found no one. He mentioned the incident to his supervisor, Chief Ranger Dorothy Vasquez, who noted it in the park log but took no further action. Acoustic tricks were common in the gorge, and misheard echoes seemed plausible. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, additional reports accumulated. Most came from hikers who mentioned strange echoes to rangers after their visits. The reports were casual, often presented as curiosities rather than complaints. A family from Utah mentioned that when their daughter shouted, "Hello down there," the echo came back as, "Hello down there where the water was." A couple from California reported shouting, "Beautiful day," and hearing back, "Beautiful day to remember." The words were always in the speaker's own voice. Multiple witnesses confirmed this. The echo sounded exactly like them, with the same pitch, tone, and cadence, just extended with additional words. The additions were grammatically correct and contextually relevant, though not always meaningful. Ranger Vasquez began keeping a more systematic log of the reports in 1984. She created a simple form that visiting rangers could use to document echo anomalies, including the location within the park, the exact words spoken, the echo received, and the number of witnesses present. By 1987, she'd collected 23 documented incidents. One report stood out. In April of 1986, a geology professor from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, named Dr. Raymond Torres, visited the park with 2 graduate students. They were studying the erosion patterns of bentonite formations and spent several hours in a section of the gorge known as Miller Point Overlook. During their work, one of the students, Marcus Webb, called across a ravine to his colleague, shouting, "Can you hear me clearly?" The echo that returned was, "Can you hear me clearly from where I'm standing now?" Dr. Torres heard it. All three members of the research team heard it. They repeated the experiment multiple times that afternoon, shouting various phrases into different canyons. In approximately one-third of their attempts, the echo included additional words. The additions were always grammatically complete sentences or phrases. When Webb shouted, "This formation is interesting," the echo came back as, "This formation is interesting," from below. Dr. Torres documented the experience in his field notes and later submitted a formal inquiry to the Nevada Division of State Parks, requesting information about acoustic studies that might have been conducted at Cathedral Gorge. His inquiry was forwarded to the state's Natural Resources Division, which responded in June of 1986 with a brief letter stating that the park's acoustic properties were consistent with expected behavior for narrow canyon formations and that no formal studies were planned. Dr. Torres pursued the matter through the university. He contacted colleagues in the physics department, including Dr. Janet Holbrook, an acoustician who specialized in environmental sound propagation. Dr. Holbrook was intrigued and requested permission from state parks to conduct acoustic measurements at Cathedral Gorge. Her request, submitted in August of 1986, was approved with the condition that any findings be shared with the Division of State Parks before publication. Dr. Holbrook visited the park in October of 1986 with recording equipment and frequency analysis tools. She selected 3 locations where anomalous echoes had been most frequently reported: Miller Point, Overlook, a slot canyon known as the Narrows, and a formation called Eagle Point. She conducted tests using calibrated sound sources, recording devices, and standardized phrases spoken by multiple team members. Her preliminary findings, documented in a report submitted to state parks in December of 1986, confirmed unusual acoustic properties, but offered no explanation for the reported additional words. Her recordings captured clear echoes with normal decay patterns. In several instances, the recorded echoes did appear to contain sounds that extended beyond the original utterance, but the additional sounds were unclear and could not be definitively identified as words. Dr. Holbrook noted in her report that human perception of speech is highly susceptible to pattern recognition. The brain often hears words in ambiguous sounds. She suggested that visitors might be interpreting natural acoustic artifacts as meaningful additions to their speech. However, she also noted that the consistency of reports, the additions were always grammatically appropriate, was difficult to explain through random acoustic effects alone. She recommended a more comprehensive study using advanced recording equipment and controlled conditions. Her recommendation was acknowledged, but not acted upon. When Dr. Holbrook followed up in March of 1987, she was informed that budget constraints prevented approval of additional research at that time. The reports continued through the late 1980s and 1990s. Ranger logs from that period, archived at the Nevada State Library, contain dozens of brief notations about echo anomalies. Most are just a sentence or two, date, location, and a phrase like "visitor reported extended echo" or "anomalous acoustic response noted." In May of 1992, a different kind of report was filed. A park visitor named Patricia O'Malley, a software engineer from Reno, was hiking alone in the Narrows when she decided to test the echoes she'd heard about from other visitors. She shouted, "Is anyone listening?" The echo came back as, "Is anyone listening who remembers?" She tried again, this time shouting, "What do you mean?" The echo returned as, "What do you mean by the question you asked before?" O'Malley was unsettled enough to cut her hike short and report the experience to rangers at the visitor center. The ranger on duty, Michael Brennan, documented her account and noted that she appeared credible and genuinely disturbed. He mentioned in his log that the echo's response seemed to reference her previous utterance, which would be unusual for any known acoustic phenomenon. O'Malley returned to the park in June of 1992 with a tape recorder. She repeated her experiment in the same location. This time, when she shouted, "Is anyone listening?" the echo came back normal, just her own words repeated and decaying naturally. She tried several other phrases. All echoes were normal. She never heard the anomalous responses again. Her recordings were reviewed by Ranger Brennan, who sent copies to the Division of State Parks, along with a request for clarification about what information should be shared with visitors who asked about the echo phenomenon. The division's response, dated July 15, 1992, instructed rangers to acknowledge that the park's acoustic properties sometimes produced unusual effects, but to avoid suggesting anything supernatural or unexplained. Rangers were advised not to encourage visitors to seek out or test the anomalies. Through the 1990s and 2000s, the echo reports became part of the park's unofficial folklore. Online forums dedicated to Nevada tourism occasionally featured threads about Cathedral Gorge's talking walls. Most posts were anecdotal. Someone's uncle had visited and heard strange echoes, or a friend had shouted into a canyon and gotten back more than they'd sent. Few of these accounts could be verified. In 2009, a filmmaker named Lisa Tanaka visited Cathedral Gorge while researching a documentary about Nevada's state parks. She interviewed several longtime rangers, including Dorothy Vasquez, who had retired in 2003 but still lived in Panaca. Vasquez confirmed that echo reports had been consistent throughout her career, that she'd personally witnessed the phenomenon twice, and that she'd been told by supervisors not to discuss it in detail with media or researchers. When Tanaka asked why, Vasquez said she'd never been given a specific reason, only that it was park policy to avoid encouraging speculation about unexplained phenomena that might attract the wrong kind of visitor attention. Vasquez shared copies of ranger logs from the 1980s, which Tanaka included in her documentary. The film was never completed, but portions were uploaded to a video sharing platform in 2011. In 2015, a request filed under the Nevada Public Records Act sought any acoustic studies conducted at Cathedral Gorge State Park. The request was submitted by a graduate student researching acoustic anomalies in natural formations. The Division of State Parks responded that no formal studies had been conducted by the state. However, the response included a note that consultation with federal agencies regarding the park's acoustic properties had occurred in 1988, but that records of that consultation were maintained by the consulting agency and were not available through state records. The graduate student, whose name was redacted in the publicly released response, submitted follow-up requests to the U.S. Geological Survey, the National Park Service, and the Bureau of Land Management. None of these agencies acknowledged possessing records related to acoustic studies at Cathedral Gorge. Dr. Janet Holbrook, the acoustician who'd conducted the 1986 study, retired from the University of Nevada in 2012. In a 2017 interview for an academic oral history project, she mentioned Cathedral Gorge briefly. She stated that her findings had been inconclusive, that she'd recommended further study, and that she'd been surprised when no follow-up research was authorized. She mentioned receiving a phone call in 1988 from someone who identified themselves as being with a federal research program. She didn't recall which agency, asking questions about her methodology and findings. She sent them a copy of her report and never heard back. Cathedral Gorge State Park remains open to visitors. The formations continue to erode at their slow, steady pace. Park rangers still maintain logs of unusual visitor reports, though the current format is digital and less detailed than the handwritten logs from earlier decades. When visitors ask about the echoes, rangers acknowledge that the acoustics are interesting and encourage people to explore safely. The reports continue, not frequently, maybe a handful each year that are documented, and likely many more that aren't. Someone shouts into a canyon and hears their voice come back with additions, words they didn't speak, in a voice that sounds exactly like theirs, completing thoughts they hadn't finished, or adding phrases that suggest context they hadn't provided. Most visitors assume it's an auditory illusion, a trick of acoustics and expectation. They take photos, hike the trails, and leave with a story about the strange echoes in Cathedral Gorge. But some of them, the ones who heard their own voice tell them something they didn't say, who heard grammar and syntax emerge from rock walls that should only reflect sound. Some of them leave with questions they can't answer and memories of words they're certain they didn't speak but heard themselves say anyway. Bouncing back from stone that's been listening for millions of years and perhaps has learned to respond. There are spaces that refuse to be documented, and since 1983, Room 44 of the Mizpah Hotel has existed only to those standing inside it. The Mizpah Hotel stands 5 stories tall on Main Street in Tonopah, Nevada, a town situated roughly halfway between Reno and Las Vegas in Nye County. Tonopah was founded in 1900 following a silver strike and quickly grew to become one of Nevada's most prosperous mining towns, with a peak population of nearly 10,000 by 1907. The Mizpah, its name derived from a Hebrew word meaning watchtower, opened in 1908 as the finest hotel between Salt Lake City and San Francisco, hosting mining executives, investors, and travelers passing through the high desert. The hotel's decline mirrored the town's fortunes. By the 1950s, as mining operations wound down and traffic shifted to newer highways, the Mizpah struggled to maintain occupancy. It closed briefly in the 1970s, reopened under new management in 1979, then closed again in 1999. The building sat vacant through most of the 2000s, its ornate lobby and 70 guest rooms gradually deteriorating. A restoration effort began in 2011, funded by investors interested in historic preservation and Tonopah's modest but growing tourism industry. Room 44 was on the 4th floor, at the end of a corridor overlooking Main Street. According to hotel records preserved by the Central Nevada Historical Society, the room had been occupied regularly during the hotel's operational decades with no reported incidents. It was a standard double room, approximately 250 square feet, with a brass bed, period furniture, and a window facing west toward the distant Toyabe Range. The photographic anomaly was first documented in August of 1983, though its possible earlier incidents went unrecorded. Margaret Delgado, a photographer from Reno, was documenting Nevada's historic hotels for a book project. She spent 2 days in Tonopah in August of 1983, photographing the Mizpah's exterior and several interior spaces with the owner's permission. The hotel was operating with limited occupancy at the time. Perhaps a dozen of its 70 rooms were in regular use. Delgado was interested in capturing the architectural details of guest rooms that still retained original furnishings. The owner, Frank Morrison, gave her access to several unused rooms on the upper floors. On August 17th, she photographed Room 44. According to her notes, archived with her estate, after her death in 2009, the room appeared normal when she entered. The furniture was dusty but intact. Afternoon light came through the window. She set up her tripod and photographed the room from multiple angles using a 35mm film camera, a Nikon FM2 with professional-grade Kodak film. When she developed the film, 3 days later at her studio in Reno, every photograph of Room 44 showed an empty space. Not empty of furniture, empty of dimension. The images showed what appeared to be a blank indistinct void where the room should have been. Walls, furniture, windows. None of it appeared in the photographs. Other images from the same roll, taken in the Mizpah's lobby and other rooms, developed normally. Delgado assumed the film had been damaged or improperly loaded. She returned to Tonopah on August 26th with fresh film and photographed room 44 again. The results were identical. The room appeared normal to her eyes, but the developed photographs showed only an empty, undefined space. She mentioned the problem to Morrison, who suggested the lighting in the room might be causing exposure issues. Delgado returned a third time in September with different film and additional lighting equipment. Same result. The photographs showed nothing recognizable as a hotel room, just an absence where room 44 should have been. Morrison found Delgado's account unusual, but wasn't particularly concerned. The hotel's occupancy was low, and room 44 wasn't one of the better rooms anyway. He made a note in the maintenance log about potential photography issues, but took no further action. Delgado excluded the Mizpah from her book project and didn't publicly discuss the incident. The next documented case came in 1991. A guest named Robert Yamada was staying at the Mizpah while working on a contract at the nearby Tonopah test range. He'd been assigned room 44 and took a snapshot of the room using a Polaroid camera to document the historic interior for his personal collection. The Polaroid developed blank, not underexposed or overexposed, but showing only a grayish void. Yamada assumed the camera was malfunctioning. He tried again with a disposable camera he'd purchased in town. When those photographs were developed, they showed the same empty result. He mentioned it to the front desk, and the hotel manager at the time, Linda Vasquez, made a note in the guest log. Yamada checked out the following day and didn't pursue the matter. Vasquez became curious after Yamada's report. She found the 1983 maintenance note about photography issues in room 44 and decided to test it herself. In October of 1991, she entered the room with her personal camera, a Canon SureShot point-and-shoot, and photographed the interior. When the film was developed, room 44 appeared as an indistinct void. She repeated the experiment with a video camera borrowed from a friend. The video footage showed normal recordings of the hotel hallway, but when she entered room 44 and aimed the camera inside, the viewfinder displayed only static interference. The recorded tape, when played back, showed a gray blur where the room should have been. Vasquez documented her findings in a memo to the hotel's owner, who by then had changed. The Mizpah had been sold in 1989. The new owner, a small investment group based in Las Vegas, acknowledged the memo but expressed no interest in investigating. The hotel was struggling financially, and room 44's photographic issues seemed irrelevant to operations. Through the 1990s, occasional guests reported the same phenomenon. The reports were sporadic, maybe one or two per year, documented in guest comment cards or mentioned to staff. Most guests never attempted to photograph their rooms, so the anomaly affected only a small percentage of people who stayed in room 44. In 1998, a paranormal investigation team from California requested permission to study the Mizpah, having heard rumors about unexplained phenomena. The hotel, facing financial difficulties, agreed in exchange for a modest fee. The team spent 3 nights in the building in November of 1998, using various recording equipment including infrared cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and digital audio recorders. Their report, posted to their website in December of 1998, noted that room 44 could not be successfully photographed or filmed with any equipment they used. Digital cameras showed error messages or captured blank images. Film cameras produced empty results. Video cameras showed interference or nothing at all. The team offered no explanation, but confirmed that the room appeared normal to direct observation. They could see and touch the furniture, walk around the space, and perceive it normally with all senses except through photographic documentation. The hotel closed permanently in 1999. The building sat vacant for over a decade, accessible only to occasional urban explorers and local historians. During this period, several people entered Room 44 and attempted to photograph it. Reports posted to urban exploration forums between 2000 and 2010 consistently described the same result. The room was visible in person, but could not be captured in any photographic medium. In 2004, a physics professor from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, named Dr. Raymond Torres, visited the Mizpah as part of research into optical phenomena in abandoned buildings. He was aware of the Room 44 reports and brought multiple cameras, digital SLR, film camera, and a smartphone with a camera function. Dr. Torres entered Room 44 in June of 2004. His written report, filed with the university's physics department, confirmed that the room appeared normal to visual observation, but could not be photographed. He noted that his cameras functioned properly outside the room and in other parts of the hotel, but all failed to capture Room 44's interior. His smartphone displayed a camera error message when aimed into the room, but worked normally everywhere else. Dr. Torres hypothesized several possibilities in his report. One was that unusual electromagnetic fields in the room interfered with camera sensors and film emulsions, though he noted this didn't explain why human vision was unaffected. Another possibility was that some property of the room's materials or geometry created optical conditions that cameras couldn't process, though again, this seemed inconsistent with the fact that multiple camera types and technologies all failed in the same way. He recommended a more thorough investigation using specialized optical equipment, but his request for research funding was denied. The university administration saw limited academic value in studying an abandoned hotel room in rural Nevada. When restoration of the Mizpah Hotel began in 2011, the project managers reviewed maintenance records and found the accumulated documentation about Room 44. The lead contractor, a preservation specialist named Patricia O'Malley, decided to inspect the room before renovation work began. She entered Room 44 in March of 2011 with a project photographer. The photographer attempted to document the room's pre-renovation condition using a high-end digital camera. The camera would not capture the room. Every image showed an empty gray field. They tried different equipment with identical results. O'Malley consulted with the restoration project's investors. The decision was made to exclude Room 44 from the renovation. In August of 2012, contractors sealed the room's door with drywall and plaster, making it appear as though the room had never existed. The fourth-floor hallway was reconfigured slightly, and the room numbers were adjusted so there was no longer a Room 44. The numbers jumped from 43 to 45. The sealed space remains behind the wall. Building plans filed with Nye County show its location, but externally, no indication of the room exists. The Mizpah Hotel reopened in 2013 and operates successfully as a boutique hotel. Staff are instructed not to discuss the sealed room, and most current employees are unaware of its history. In 2016, a journalist from Las Vegas researching Nevada ghost stories contacted the hotel about Room 44. The hotel's management declined to comment beyond confirming that the renovation had reconfigured some spaces and that certain areas of the building were not accessible to guests. The journalist published a brief article mentioning the photographic anomaly, but could not verify details beyond what had been posted on urban exploration forums. Dr. Torres, now retired, maintains his report in personal files. When asked about Room 44 in a 2019 interview for a physics podcast, he stated simply that he documented a phenomenon he couldn't explain. A space that existed for human observation, but not for photographic recording. He acknowledged this seemed impossible according to understood optical principles, but he'd witnessed it personally and confirmed it with multiple instruments. Margaret Delgado's original photographs from 1983 are archived with her estate. The negatives show normal exposures for every image except those of room 44, which appear as gray, formless voids. Her notes describe photographing a furnished hotel room. The film insists she photographed nothing at all. And behind a plastered wall on the 4th floor of the Mizpah Hotel, room 44 still exists. Furniture aging in darkness, dust settling on surfaces no photograph will ever show, a space that can be entered and observed but never captured, never proven, except through the testimony of those who stood inside it and found that when they tried to document where they'd been, their cameras insisted they'd been nowhere, looking at nothing, in a room that refused to exist for any lens that tried to see it. Some boundaries refuse to stay where they're planted, and in the high desert near Battle Mountain, a property line spent 6 months rearranging itself into patterns no fence was meant to form. Battle Mountain sits in Lander County in north-central Nevada, approximately 230 miles northeast of Reno along Interstate 80. The town was established in 1866 as a station along the Central Pacific Railroad and named for a small skirmish between cavalry and Shoshone warriors that occurred nearby. The surrounding landscape is classic Great Basin terrain, wide valleys flanked by low mountain ranges, covered in sagebrush and rabbit brush, with elevations ranging from 4,500 to 6,000 feet. The area supports cattle ranching and gold mining, the two industries that have sustained the region's economy for over a century. Rainfall averages less than 9 inches annually. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 95 degrees, while winter nights drop well below freezing. The soil is alkaline, rocky, and poorly suited for agriculture beyond hardy grazing land. Properties in the area tend to be large. Parcels of several hundred to several thousand acres are common, necessary to support viable ranching operations in such arid conditions. The remoteness is profound. Many ranches are 10 or 15 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by dirt tracks that become impassable during winter storms or spring runoff. Neighbors might be 5 miles away. Cell phone coverage is non-existent across much of the region. Satellite phones and CB radios remain the primary means of communication for rural residents. In March of 1998, Dennis Kowalski owned and operated a cattle ranch approximately 18 miles northwest of Battle Mountain. The property encompassed roughly 1,400 acres of high desert grazing land, bounded on 3 sides by Bureau of Land Management territory and on the 4th by another private ranch. Kowalski had purchased the property in 1992 and spent the subsequent years improving the infrastructure, repairing buildings, drilling a well, and installing new fencing. Fencing in ranch country is perpetual work. The posts, typically 6 to 7 feet tall, made of treated wood or steel, must be set firmly in the ground, often requiring post-hole diggers or power augers to penetrate rocky soil. Wire is stretched between posts under tension, creating barriers to contain cattle and exclude wildlife. The fence along Kowalski's northern property line had been installed in 1996, consisting of 93 wooden posts spaced approximately 12 feet apart, covering just over 1,000 feet. On the morning of March 9, 1998, Kowalski was checking the northern fence line when he noticed something wrong. 3 of the posts were out of position. Not fallen, they were still upright, still firmly planted, but they'd moved. One post, that had been near the fence line's western end, was now approximately 30 feet south of where it should have been. 2 others had shifted shorter distances, maybe 10 or 15 feet. Kowalski's first assumption was vandalism or theft. though it made no sense. The posts hadn't been removed. They were still in the ground, standing vertical, with no visible signs of excavation around their bases. The soil around each relocated post was undisturbed, showing no evidence of digging or disturbance. It was as though the posts had simply been repositioned without anyone touching the ground. He documented the locations with a handheld GPS unit and took photographs with a 35mm camera. Then he reset the posts in their correct positions, using a post hole digger to replant them where the fence line should run. The work took most of the day. The following morning, March 10th, the posts had moved again, not back to where he'd found them originally, but to new positions. This time, 5 posts were out of place, forming a rough arc approximately 40 feet from the fence line. Again, no evidence of digging. The posts stood upright, firmly planted, as though they'd grown there. Kowalski began keeping detailed records. He mapped every post's position each morning using his GPS unit, photographed the configurations, and noted the date and time. Over the next week, the posts continued relocating overnight. The number of moved posts increased, first 5, then 8, then 12. By March 17th, 19 posts were displaced from the original fence line. The patterns became more complex. Initially, the posts formed simple geometric arrangements, lines, arcs, loose clusters. By late March, they were arranging themselves into more intricate configurations. On March 28th, Kowalski documented 19 posts forming a perfect circle approximately 60 feet in diameter. The circle's center was empty, just sagebrush and bare ground, but the posts stood at precise intervals around the circumference, as though marking something. Kowalski contacted his neighbor to the east, Margaret Delgado, whose property adjoined his along a different boundary. He asked if she'd experienced anything similar. She hadn't, but she agreed to visit his ranch and observe the phenomenon. On April 2nd, Delgado spent the day at Kowalski's property. Together, they photographed the post's current configuration, a double line of 23 posts running northwest to southeast, parallel to each other, spaced about 15 feet apart. That evening, Delgado returned to her own ranch. The next morning, she drove back to Kowalski's property. The posts had rearranged overnight into a spiral pattern, starting from a central point and expanding outward over approximately 80 feet. Delgado confirmed that the configuration was different from what they documented the previous day. She agreed to serve as a witness and signed a statement Kowalski had drafted, describing the phenomenon. In mid-April, Kowalski contacted the Lander County Sheriff's Office to report the incidents. A deputy named Frank Morrison drove out to the property on April 16th. Morrison walked the fence line, examined the posts, and reviewed Kowalski's photographs and GPS logs. He could offer no explanation. The posts showed no signs of having been pulled from the ground and replanted. There were no tire tracks from vehicles, no footprints beyond those left by Kowalski and Delgado, no evidence of equipment that would be necessary to move and replant heavy fence posts. Morrison's report, filed with the sheriff's office on April 20th, described the situation as unusual, but offered no theory about causation. He noted that the property was remote and that access would be difficult for vandals, especially considering the number of posts involved and the lack of disturbance to the surrounding ground. The case was logged but not actively investigated. Kowalski continued documenting. By May, the patterns had become extraordinarily complex. On May 12th, he photographed 37 posts, arranged in a configuration that, when he later showed the photograph to a surveyor acquaintance, was identified as a near-perfect logarithmic spiral, the same pattern found in nautilus shells and galaxy formations. The mathematical precision seemed impossible for random movement. On May 24th, a pattern appeared that Kowalski couldn't initially interpret. 41 posts had arranged themselves in a specific configuration over a roughly circular area 100 feet in diameter. He photographed it from multiple angles and made detailed measurements. Later, when he showed the photographs to a teacher in Battle Mountain who had an interest in astronomy, she recognized it immediately. The posts had formed a two-dimensional representation of the Pleiades star cluster, accurate enough that individual stars could be identified by their relative positions. Kowalski decided to attempt video documentation. He borrowed a camcorder from a friend and set it up on a tripod overlooking the section of his property where the posts had been most active. On the evening of June 3rd, he activated the camera, aimed it at the current post configuration, and left it recording overnight. The camera was battery-powered and had enough capacity for approximately 6 hours of continuous recording. The next morning, when he reviewed the footage, the tape showed 6 hours of unchanging desert landscape. The posts remained stationary throughout the recording, but when he walked out to check the actual fence line, the posts had moved. 28 of them now formed a triangular grid pattern, completely different from the configuration visible in the video recording. He repeated the experiment on June 5th and June 7th. Both times, the video showed no movement. Both times, the posts were in different positions the following morning than they'd been when he'd started recording. On June 12th, Kowalski contacted Dr. Raymond Torres, a geology professor at the University of Nevada, Reno, explaining the situation and offering to provide documentation if Dr. Torres was interested in investigating. Dr. Torres was skeptical, but agreed to visit the property. He arrived on June 19th with a graduate student named Lisa Tanaka, bringing surveying equipment and cameras. Dr. Torres and Tanaka spent 2 days at the ranch. They photographed the current post configuration, took soil samples from around several posts, and used ground-penetrating radar to examine the subsurface around the posts' bases. The radar showed no anomalies. The posts appeared to be set in post holes of normal depth and dimension, with no voids or unusual geological features beneath them. On the evening of June 20th, Dr. Torres and Tanaka set up motion-activated cameras at multiple locations around the property, aimed at clusters of posts that Kowalski identified as most frequently moving. They also installed seismometers to detect ground vibrations that might indicate excavation or movement. They remained at the property overnight. The seismometers recorded nothing unusual, just normal background vibration from wind and small animal activity. The motion-activated cameras captured images of a coyote, a jackrabbit, and several birds, but no human activity and no post movement. In the morning, the posts had moved again. 19 of them had formed a hexagonal pattern. The motion-activated cameras showed no activity during the night beyond wildlife. Dr. Torres had no explanation. In his field notes dated June 21, 1998, he wrote that the phenomenon was inconsistent with known geological or human mechanisms, and that further study would require equipment and funding beyond what he had available. Dr. Torres submitted a brief report to the university's geology department in July of 1998, describing the observations but offering no conclusions. The report was filed and no follow-up research was authorized. When a journalist from the Reno Gazette-Journal contacted Dr. Torres in August for comment, he confirmed he'd visited the property and observed unusual post positions, but declined to speculate about causes. Through July and August, the post movements continued but became less frequent. Kowalski's logs show relocations occurring every 4 or 5 days rather than nightly. The patterns remained complex, geometric arrangements, spirals, grids, but the number of posts involved in each configuration decreased. On September 2, 1998, Kowalski documented that all 93 posts had returned to their original positions along the fence line. They were back where he'd planted them in 1996, spaced 12 feet apart, forming a straight boundary across his northern property line. He verified their positions with his GPS logs from before the movements began. Locations matched exactly. The posts never moved again. Kowalski continued ranching on the property until 2004, when he sold it to a family from California. He included his documentation, photographs, GPS logs, witness statements, Dr. Torres's report, in the property transfer records as a disclosure, though he noted that no unusual activity had occurred since September of 1998. The new owners reported no fence post movements during their tenure. When they sold the property in 2009, they made no mention of Kowalski's records to the buyers. The current owners, who purchased the ranch in 2015, are reportedly unaware of the 1998 incident. Margaret Delgado, Kowalski's neighbor who witnessed some of the configurations, passed away in 2013. Her signed statement remains in Kowalski's archived documentation held by the Lander County Historical Society after he donated it in 2006. Dennis Kowalski now lives in Elko, Nevada. In a 2018 interview for a podcast about unexplained Nevada phenomena, he confirmed the events as he documented them. He stated that he'd been a rancher for 30 years and understood fence maintenance, soil mechanics, and the physical realities of working with heavy posts in rocky ground. What happened on his property in 1998, he said, was not consistent with any of that understanding. Posts don't move themselves. They don't arrange themselves into mathematical patterns. They especially don't return themselves to their original positions after 6 months of nightly migrations. But that's what happened. He has the photographs, the GPS coordinates, the witness statements, and somewhere on a ranch northwest of Battle Mountain, 93 fence posts stand in a straight line along a northern boundary, marking property in the way fences have always marked property, holding wire and keeping cattle contained as though they'd never spent half a year arranging themselves into spirals and star charts and patterns no rancher would build and no fence was meant to form. Some departures happen on schedules no timetable lists, and in November of 2005, a train that couldn't exist made multiple stops in Caliente without ever arriving or leaving from anywhere. Caliente sits in Lincoln County in southeastern Nevada, approximately 150 miles north of Las Vegas, along what was once the main line of the Union Pacific Railroad. The town was established in 1901 specifically to service the railroad, a division point where locomotives would be maintained, crews would change, and passengers could rest. At its peak in the 1940s, Caliente's population reached 4,500, supported entirely by railroad operations. The massive Mission Revival-style depot, completed in 1923, served as the town's centerpiece, a testament to the railroad's importance to the region. By the late 20th century, the railroad's role had diminished significantly. Diesel locomotives with longer ranges eliminated the need for frequent division points. Passenger service was discontinued in the 1980s. Freight traffic decreased as routes were consolidated. The last scheduled train passed through Caliente in 1997, after which Union Pacific officially abandoned the line. The tracks remained in place, but the company ceased all maintenance and operations on the route. The depot building was converted into city offices and a small museum. The town's population declined to just over 1,000 residents. Caliente became a quiet community sustained by ranching, a few small businesses, and travelers passing through on Highway 93. The railroad tracks, though no longer used, still ran through the center of town, a physical reminder of what the community had once been. On the night of November 3, 2005, Margaret Kowalski was closing her restaurant on Clover Street, approximately 2 blocks from the old depot, when she heard a train whistle. The sound was clear and distinct, a long, low blast followed by 2 shorter tones, the standard warning for a railroad crossing. She looked at the clock. It was 2:47 in the morning. Kowalski walked to her restaurant's window and looked toward the tracks. She could see a train moving slowly through town from the north, heading south. The locomotive's headlight was on, illuminating the tracks ahead. Behind it, she counted at least 6 passenger cars, all fully lit. Through the windows, she could see people, passengers sitting in seats, some standing in aisles, all visible in the interior lighting. She watched the train pass. It moved at perhaps 15 miles per hour, slow enough that she could observe details. The locomotive appeared to be a diesel engine of an older style. The passenger cars had a vintage appearance, rounded roofs, large windows, the kind of cars used in the 1940s or 50s. The entire consist took approximately 3 minutes to pass through town. When the train had moved south beyond her line of sight, Kowalski called the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office to report it. She assumed a railroad company was running some kind of historical excursion or equipment transfer. The dispatcher on duty, Robert Yamada, took her call and made a note in the log, but explained that the tracks through Caliente had been abandoned and that no train should be operating on that line. Kowalski insisted on what she'd seen. Yamada suggested she might have heard a train on a different route, perhaps Highway 93's noise traveling in unusual ways, or equipment being moved on a nearby ranch. Kowalski replied that she'd lived in Caliente for 30 years, had worked in a building next to the railroad tracks for most of that time, and knew what a train sounded and looked like. On the night of November 7th, the train appeared again. This time, 4 people reported it. Dennis Morrison, a shift worker at a small manufacturing plant east of town, was driving home on Clover Street at 2:47 a.m. when he had to stop his vehicle as a train crossed the road in front of him. He watched it pass, a locomotive and multiple passenger cars, all lit, moving south through town at low speed. Patricia O'Brien, who lived in a house adjacent to the tracks, was awakened by the sound of a train horn at the same time. She looked out her bedroom window and saw the train passing, close enough that she could see passengers clearly through the car windows. She described them as dressed in clothing that appeared old-fashioned, suits and dresses that looked like something from several decades earlier. Linda Vasquez and her husband Frank were walking their dog near the old depot when they heard the train approaching from the north. They stepped away from the tracks and watched it pass. Linda later told the sheriff's office that the train looked like something from a museum, and that the passengers she'd seen through the windows appeared to be from a different era. All 4 witnesses reported the sighting to the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office. Deputy Sarah Delgado responded by driving to the railroad tracks and inspecting them with a flashlight. She found no evidence of recent train passage, no fresh disturbance to the ballast rock between the ties, no oil or grease marks, no displacement of the vegetation that had grown over the rails in the 8 years since the line's abandonment. Delgado contacted Union Pacific's regional office in Salt Lake City on November 8th. She spoke with a dispatcher who confirmed that Union Pacific had not operated trains on the Caliente line since 1997 and had no plans to reactivate it. The dispatcher stated that no Union Pacific equipment was in that area, and no permission had been granted for any other railroad to use the abandoned track. On November 10th, Deputy Delgado and Sheriff Raymond Torres drove the length of the railroad track within Lincoln County, inspecting it for any signs of use. They found none. The rails showed rust and weathering consistent with years of disuse. Vegetation had grown across the tracks in multiple locations. In several places, sand and debris had accumulated on the rails, accumulation that would have been disturbed if a train had passed recently. The train appeared again on November 14th, November 19th, and November 24th, always at 2:47 in the morning, always moving south through Caliente, always consisting of a diesel locomotive and 6 to 8 passenger cars. The number of witnesses increased. By late November, at least 15 residents had reported seeing or hearing it. Michael Brennan, a retired railroad employee who had worked for Union Pacific for 35 years before moving to Caliente in 2002, observed the train on November 19th. He'd heard about the sightings and deliberately stayed awake to watch for it. At 2:47 a.m., he positioned himself near the depot and witnessed the train passing. In a statement given to the sheriff's office, he identified the locomotive as a model consistent with Union Pacific's fleet from the 1940s, a Hood unit diesel that would have been state-of-the-art at that time, but had been retired from service decades ago. He noted that the locomotive bore no visible identifying numbers or lettering, though Union Pacific equipment was typically marked clearly. Brennan also observed the passengers. Through the lit windows of the passenger cars, he could see people of various ages, dressed in styles he associated with the 1940s. He described seeing men in suits and hats, women in dresses, and a few children. The passengers appeared to be engaged in normal activities, sitting, talking, reading. None seemed aware of being observed. Dr. Raymond Kowalski, a physician in Caliente, witnessed the train on November 24th. He attempted to photograph it using a digital camera. He took multiple photographs as the train passed, aiming at the locomotive and passenger cars. When he reviewed the images later, all showed only empty tracks. The photographs captured the rails, the depot building in the background, and the surrounding area, but no train. The timestamp on the photos confirmed they'd been taken at 2:47 a.m. Dr. Kowalski shared the photographs with other witnesses, who insisted the train had been clearly visible when he was taking the pictures. Several people had been standing near him and had seen both him photographing and the train passing. But the camera had recorded nothing. Sheriff Torres contacted Union Pacific again on November 28th, providing detailed witness statements and requesting any historical information about trains that might have operated through Caliente at 2:47 in the morning during the 1940s. The company's Historical Archives Division responded in December, stating that they had no specific schedules from that era readily available, but that passenger trains had run through Caliente regularly during the 1940s on various schedules. The response did not address the current sightings. Torres also contacted the Federal Railroad Administration, reporting that a train of unknown origin was apparently operating on abandoned track in his jurisdiction. The FRA responded that they had no record of any authorized operations on the former Union Pacific line through Caliente, and that operating trains on abandoned track without proper authorization would constitute a serious violation. They requested any photographic or video evidence of the train. Torres explained that attempts to photograph the train had been unsuccessful. The FRA representative suggested the witnesses might be mistaken or that the sightings might involve something other than an actual train. Torres replied that he'd personally witnessed the train on November 24th and that multiple credible residents, including a retired railroad employee, had provided consistent accounts. The train's final reported appearance was on November 29, 2005. Approximately 20 residents positioned themselves along the tracks to observe it. At 2:47 a.m., the train whistle sounded from the north. The train appeared, passed through town at its usual slow speed, and continued south until it was out of sight. Multiple witnesses attempted to photograph and video record it. All recordings showed empty tracks. After November 29th, the train did not appear again. Residents waited through December, with several people maintaining watch near the tracks at 2:47 a.m. each night. Nothing occurred. The train had apparently made its last passage. Sheriff Torres submitted a comprehensive report to the Nevada Department of Public Safety in January of 2006, documenting the sightings, witness statements, track inspections, and communication with Union Pacific. The report concluded that multiple credible witnesses had observed a passenger train operating through Caliente during November 2005, but that physical evidence of the train's passage was absent and that no railroad company acknowledged operating equipment in the area. The Department of Public Safety acknowledged the report, but took no investigative action. A spokesperson stated that without physical evidence or ongoing occurrences, there was no clear jurisdiction for state-level involvement. Union Pacific conducted its own inspection of the Caliente line in February of 2006. A track maintenance crew walked the entire route through Lincoln County, examining the rails and ties. Their report, shared with Sheriff Torres, confirmed that the track showed no signs of recent use by heavy equipment. The company's position remained that no Union Pacific trains had operated on that line since 1997, and that the track was not suitable for train operations, without significant rehabilitation. Michael Brennan, the retired railroad employee, researched historical schedules and operations through 2006. He found references to a passenger train designated as train number 37 that had operated through Caliente in the 1940s, southbound, with a scheduled arrival time of 2:48 a.m. The schedule had been in effect from 1942 through 1946. Brennan shared this information with Sheriff Torres, who added it to his case file. In 2008, a documentary filmmaker from Las Vegas contacted Sheriff Torres about making a film about the sightings. Torres provided copies of witness statements and his reports, but declined to participate in filming. The documentary was never completed. The railroad tracks still run through Caliente. In 2010, portions of the rail were removed and sold for scrap metal. Other sections remain in place, rusting and gradually being reclaimed by desert vegetation. The depot building continues to house city offices. The Mission Revival architecture, built to serve travelers who would arrive by train, now stands as a monument to a transportation era that ended decades ago. But among the 1,500 or so current residents of Caliente, there are at least 20 who stood beside those tracks on November nights in 2005 and watched a fully lit passenger train move through town at 2:47 in the morning. They saw the locomotive's headlight, heard the horn's warning, observed passengers dressed in suits and dresses from another era sitting in illuminated cars as the train passed at 15 miles per hour through a town it hadn't served in 8 years, on tracks that showed no evidence of its passage, coming from nowhere, recorded, and heading toward no documented destination, keeping a schedule that hadn't existed for 60 years, but that, for 1 month, it followed with absolute precision. Some places hold conversations long after the speakers have gone, and near Berlin Ichthyosaur State Park, the wind carries words, "No one is speaking anymore." Berlin Ichthyosaur State Park sits in Nye County in central Nevada, approximately 23 miles east of Gabbs, along a winding dirt road that climbs into the Shoshone Mountains. The park encompasses approximately 1,100 acres at elevations between 6,500 and 7,000 feet. It was established in 1957 to preserve two significant features: the ghost town of Berlin, abandoned since the 1940s, and one of the world's richest ichthyosaur fossil deposits, protected within a dedicated shelter since the 1970s. Berlin itself was a silver mining town that operated from 1997 through the early 1940s. At its peak around 1909, the town supported approximately 250 residents. The Berlin mine produced modest amounts of silver ore, processed at a small mill on site. By the 1920s, production had declined significantly. The remaining residents gradually departed through the 1930s, and the town was effectively abandoned by 1911. What remains are approximately 30 wooden structures in various states of preservation: the assay office, boarding houses, machine shop, and homes, maintained by Nevada State Parks as a historical site. The landscape surrounding Berlin is high desert mountain terrain, pinon pine and juniper at lower elevations, sagebrush, and scattered brush at higher points. The climate is severe, with winter snows and summer heat. The area receives limited visitation, perhaps a few thousand people annually, mostly during spring and fall. Cell phone coverage is non-existent. The nearest town with services is Gabbs, population fewer than 300. The phenomenon was first formally documented in July of 2003, though anecdotal references suggest it may have been occurring for longer. On July 12, 2003, a geology professor from the University of Nevada, Reno, named Dr. Patricia Holbrook, was conducting field research near the fossil shelter, approximately half a mile from the Berlin town site. She was working alone, taking measurements and collecting samples for a study on late Triassic marine sediments. The day was warm and mostly still, with occasional light breezes moving through the valley. At approximately 11:30 in the morning, while standing near a ravine taking compass readings, Dr. Holbrook heard a voice. According to her field notes, dated that day, the voice was male, speaking clearly in English, and said something about, "The South Drift needs timber by Tuesday." The voice was not shouting or distant. It sounded as though someone was standing perhaps 10 feet away, speaking at normal conversational volume. Dr. Holbrook looked around immediately. She was alone. She called out, asking if anyone was there. No response. She assumed a hiker or park visitor was nearby, perhaps just out of sight beyond a ridge. She continued her work. Approximately 20 minutes later, she heard another voice, this time female, saying, "Told him the assay wouldn't be worth the fuel." Again, clear, conversational volume, apparently coming from empty air a short distance away. Dr. Holbrook searched the immediate area. She found no one. She was in an elevated position with clear sight lines in all directions. No vehicles were parked near the fossil shelter. No other visitors were visible. She made notes about the incident, but attributed it to acoustic tricks, perhaps voices from the town site or from park staff carrying across the terrain in unusual ways. She mentioned it to the park ranger on duty when she checked out that afternoon. The ranger, Dennis Morrison, told her that hikers occasionally reported hearing voices or sounds near the old town site, though he'd never experienced it himself. The next documented incident came from a couple visiting the park in September of 2003. Margaret and Robert Vasquez from Henderson were hiking the nature trail near the fossil beds when they heard fragments of conversation. According to their statement, provided to park staff and later filed with the park's incident logs, they heard multiple voices over approximately 15 minutes, brief phrases and sentence fragments that seemed to come from the wind itself. The voices were discussing mining operations, mentioning equipment, shift schedules, and ore grades. Neither Margaret nor Robert could determine where the voices originated. They described the experience as hearing radio broadcasts from empty air. When they returned to the visitor center, they asked Ranger Morrison if there was a tour group or interpretive program involving recorded historical dialogue. Morrison explained that no such program existed. The park had informational signage, but no audio installations. Through late 2003 and into 2004, additional visitors reported similar experiences. The reports came sporadically, perhaps 6 or 8 incidents over 18 months, but they shared common features. Visitors would hear clear human voices speaking English, discussing topics related to mining operations, often using terminology and phrasing that sounded dated. The voices were brief, usually just a sentence or partial sentence. They seemed to come from no particular direction, as though emerging from the air itself. In May of 2004, a linguistics graduate student from the University of California, Berkeley, named Lisa Tanaka, visited the park while researching mining communities of the early 20th century. She'd heard about the voice phenomenon through online forums dedicated to Nevada ghost towns and was curious whether the reports had any linguistic patterns worth examining. Tanaka spent 3 days at the park hiking. various trails, and spending time near both the fossil shelter and the Berlin town site. On her second day, May 19th, while sitting on the porch of the old assay office taking notes, she heard a voice. She described it in her research journal as male, middle-aged sounding, distinctly saying, "Johnston's crew finished the number 3 by Wednesday morning." The voice was clear enough that she could transcribe the words immediately. Over the next 2 hours, she heard 4 more voice fragments at irregular intervals. She recorded them all in her notes. Phrases about equipment repairs, mentions of someone named Carlson, a fragment about ore prices, and a brief exchange that sounded like 2 people discussing a shift change. None of the voices seemed aware of her presence or of each other. They were snippets, isolated fragments, as though someone was playing random excerpts from conversations. Tanaka had brought a digital audio recorder. She began recording whenever she heard voices, hoping to capture them. Over her remaining time at the park, she heard approximately 12 voice fragments. Her recorder captured 3 of them. When she reviewed the recordings later, the voices were audible but faint, far less clear than they'd sounded in person. Background wind noise obscured much of the detail, but the words were identifiable. She shared the recordings with her advisor, Dr. Raymond Kowalski, a specialist in historical linguistics and dialectology. Dr. Kowalski analyzed the phonology, vocabulary, and syntax of the recorded fragments. His preliminary assessment, documented in notes dated June 2004, identified several linguistic markers consistent with American English from the 1920s through 1940s. Specific vocabulary, drift, referring to a horizontal mine tunnel, assay as a verb, the use of crew rather than team, matched mining terminology of that era. One phrase included the word swell, used to mean good or excellent, which was common slang in the 1930s but rarely used after the 1950s. Dr. Kowalski found the recordings intriguing, but couldn't determine their source. He suggested that if historical recordings existed from Berlin's operational period, the voices might be fragments of those recordings somehow being transmitted or replayed. Tanaka noted that no such recordings were known to exist, and even if they did, there was no equipment at the park that could play them, nor any explanation for why they would be audible outdoors at random times. In August of 2004, park staff began keeping a more systematic log of voice reports. Ranger Morrison created a simple form for visitors to fill out if they experienced the phenomenon, asking them to note the time, location, approximate wording heard, and any other details. By December of 2004, 12 reports had been documented. Nevada State Parks Administration was informed of the reports in early 2005. The response, according to internal correspondence later obtained through public records requests, was to acknowledge the reports but take no investigative action. A memo from the regional supervisor dated February 2005 noted that the park was remote, visitation was low, and the reports were not presenting any safety concerns or visitor complaints. The memo suggested the phenomenon was likely auditory pareidolia, the tendency for human brains to interpret random sounds as meaningful patterns, particularly speech. In June of 2005, Dr. Holbrook returned to Berlin Ichthyosaur to continue her geological research. She'd heard about the accumulated voice reports and brought recording equipment specifically to document the phenomenon if she encountered it again. Over 4 days in the field, she heard voice fragments on 3 separate occasions. Her recordings captured 2 of them, though with significant background noise. She shared her recordings with colleagues in the physics and acoustics departments at the university, asking whether there was any known mechanism by which old sound recordings could persist or replay in outdoor environments. The consensus was that no such mechanism existed. Sound requires a medium to propagate, and without a source generating the sound waves, there's nothing to hear. Recorded sound requires playback equipment. Even in enclosed spaces with unusual acoustic properties, sound doesn't persist for decades waiting to be heard again. One colleague suggested that if radio broadcasts from the 1930s or 40s had occurred in the area, perhaps atmospheric conditions were occasionally allowing those broadcasts to be received again, a phenomenon known to occur with certain radio frequencies under specific ionospheric conditions. However, Berlin had no radio station during its operational period, and even if broadcasts from distant stations had passed through the area, modern receivers would be needed to detect them, not human ears. By 2006, the voice phenomenon had become part of the park's informal lore. Online forums about Nevada ghost towns featured threads discussing it. Some visitors came specifically hoping to hear the voices. Most heard nothing. Perhaps 1 in 20 visitors reported experiencing it based on the incident logs Ranger Morrison continued to maintain. In September of 2007, a sound engineer from Las Vegas named Michael O'Brien visited the park with professional recording equipment. He'd read about the voices online and wanted to attempt high-quality recordings. He spent 2 days near the Berlin town site with directional microphones, digital recorders, and analysis software. He captured ambient wind noise, bird calls, and distant vehicle sounds from the access road, but no voice fragments. O'Brien's conclusion, posted to his professional blog in October 2007, was that the phenomenon was likely psychological. Visitors expecting to hear voices in a ghost town environment would occasionally interpret wind sounds or other ambient noise as speech. He noted that his equipment should have been sensitive enough to capture any actual voices, but detected none. In response, 3 people who'd heard the voices at Berlin, including Dr. Holbrook and Lisa Tanaka, left comments on O'Brien's blog post asserting that what they'd heard were clearly articulated words, not ambiguous sounds subject to interpretation. Tanaka pointed out that she'd documented specific terminology and sentence structures that matched historical mining vocabulary she'd been researching. The voices weren't random sounds her brain had pattern-matched into speech. They were actual speech using period-appropriate language. The debate remained unresolved. O'Brien didn't respond to the comments. Through 2008 and 2009, reports continued at approximately the same rate. The park's visitor log forms documented brief voice fragments, usually single sentences or phrases, always related to mining operations, always sounding dated in vocabulary and phrasing. No voices ever addressed the witnesses directly or seemed aware of the present day. They were always conversational fragments about work, equipment, schedules, or conditions, the mundane talk of people going about their daily routines. Dennis Morrison retired from the Park Service in 2011. In a newspaper interview for the Reno Gazette-Journal marking his retirement, he mentioned the voice phenomenon. He stated that he'd personally heard it twice during his years at the park. Brief phrases that seemed to come from nowhere, clear as if someone was standing nearby speaking. He didn't claim to know what caused it, but said the experience was unsettling enough that he understood why visitors reported it. The park continues to operate. The Berlin ghost town remains preserved, its weathered wooden buildings standing in various stages of decay. The fossil shelter protects its ancient ichthyosaurs, and hikers still walk the trails through pinyon and juniper. Visitor reports of voice fragments continue sporadically, a few each year, documented in incident logs and mentioned to rangers at the visitor center. No investigation has explained them. No equipment has conclusively captured what witnesses describe hearing. The recordings that exist are ambiguous. Faint voices barely audible over wind, words that might be there or might be suggestion. But there are people who stood in that high desert valley amid the remnants of a town that died 70 years ago, and heard clear voices discussing timber deliveries and ore assays and shift schedules. They heard names of people long dead speaking about work long finished. They heard fragments of 1930-something carried on 21st century wind, as though the air itself had learned the rhythms of those old conversations. And occasionally, for reasons no one can identify, plays them back, not as echoes because echoes fade, but as something stranger, a persistence of voice where no voice should remain. Words without speakers, conversations that ended decades ago, but that the mountain air, for brief moments, remembers how to speak. Some storms refuse to end on their own terms, and in the summer of 2010, a column of rotating air near Fallon decided when and how it would stop. Fallon sits in Churchill County in western Nevada, approximately 60 miles east of Reno in the Lahontan Valley. The town serves as the service center for one of Nevada's few agricultural regions sustained by irrigation from the Newlands Project, one of the first federal reclamation efforts in the American West, completed in the early 1900s. The surrounding landscape is high desert, transitioning to alkali flats, with elevations around 3,900 feet. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees, and the valley experiences persistent winds, particularly in spring and summer when thermal gradients create strong convective currents. Dust devils are common in the region. Small, short-lived whirlwinds formed when intense surface heating creates columns of rising air that begin to rotate. They typically last seconds to minutes, move erratically across open terrain, and dissipate when atmospheric conditions change or when they encounter obstacles. They're a routine feature of desert summers, unremarkable except for their occasional size. The Naval Air Station Fallon occupies a significant portion of land north and east of town, serving as the Navy's premier air-to-air and air-to-ground training facility. The station encompasses hundreds of square miles of restricted airspace and ground ranges. Civilian access to much of the surrounding area is limited, though ranchers still operate on Bureau of Land Management land adjacent to military boundaries. On July 7, 2010, a dust devil formed on BLM land approximately 9 miles northeast of Fallon, near the boundary of the Naval Air Station's training range. The formation occurred at approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, observed initially by a rancher named Walter Kowalski, who was checking fence lines in his pickup truck. Kowalski noticed the dust devil because of its size. He estimated it at roughly 40 feet in diameter at its base, with a visible column extending upward, perhaps 200 feet. Dust devils of that size weren't unusual, but this one caught his attention because it remained stationary. Most dust devils moved across the landscape, but this one stayed in place, rotating steadily in the same location. He watched it for approximately 10 minutes while completing his fence inspection. When he drove away, the dust devil was still there, rotating at what appeared to be a constant speed, not dissipating or moving. He thought little of it at the time. Desert weather produced odd atmospheric effects, and a dust devil persisting for 10 or 15 minutes, while unusual, wasn't extraordinary. The following afternoon, July 8th, Kowalski was working in the same area at approximately the same time. The dust devil was there again, in what appeared to be the exact same location with the same dimensions and rotation characteristics. He drove closer this time, parking about 100 yards away. Through binoculars, he observed the column of rotating dust and debris. It maintained a consistent form, a clearly defined cylindrical shape, rotating counterclockwise, with dust and small debris visible in the vortex. He watched for half an hour. The dust devil didn't move, didn't change size, didn't show any signs of weakening. When he finally drove away at 4:30, it was still rotating. On July 9th, Kowalski returned deliberately to observe the phenomenon. He arrived at 2:45 in the afternoon. No dust devil was visible. At approximately 3:12, he noticed dust beginning to rise from a specific point on the ground, the same location where the dust devil had been the previous 2 days. Within 3 minutes, the full vortex had formed, appearing identical to what he'd observed before. Same diameter, same height, same rotation speed. He documented the time and took photographs with a digital camera. He remained until 4:45, at which point the dust devil was still rotating unchanged. When he returned the next morning to check, there was no trace of it. The ground showed no unusual disturbance. Kowalski mentioned the phenomenon to his neighbor, Linda Vasquez, who ranched adjacent property. On July 10th, both of them drove out to observe. They arrived at 3 o'clock. At 3:13, the dust devil formed in the same location, building from ground-level dust movement to full formation within minutes. Vasquez had brought a video camera and recorded approximately 20 minutes of footage. The recording showed a stable rotating column of dust maintaining constant dimensions and position. They discussed possible explanations. Vasquez suggested there might be a thermal vent or geological feature creating localized heating that generated a persistent updraft at the same time each day. Kowalski noted that dust devils required specific atmospheric conditions, not just heat, but particular wind patterns and instability, and it seemed improbable that those conditions would replicate precisely at the same time and location for multiple consecutive days. On July 11th, they returned with a third witness, Michael Brennan, a retired Air Force meteorologist who lived in Fallon. Brennan had worked in weather forecasting for 25 years and maintained an interest in atmospheric phenomena. The three arrived at the location at 2:50 in the afternoon. Brennan had brought instruments, a handheld anemometer to measure wind speed, a thermometer, and a compass. The dust devil formed at 3:14. Brennan approached to within 50 feet and took measurements. The wind speed in the vortex registered between 30 and 35 miles per hour at ground level. The ambient air temperature was 103 degrees. He walked around the dust devil's perimeter, noting that the surrounding wind conditions didn't seem conducive to dust devil formation. The ambient wind was light and variable, not strong enough to initiate the rotational dynamics typically necessary. Most significantly, Brennan observed that the dust devil wasn't moving. Dust devils form when rotating columns of air move across terrain, picking up dust and debris. They travel, sometimes erratically, sometimes in relatively straight lines, but they move. This one remained absolutely stationary, as though anchored to a specific point on the ground. Brennan documented his observations and shared them with colleagues through an online meteorology forum that evening. He described the phenomenon as unprecedented in my experience and noted that the dust devil's persistence violated basic understanding of atmospheric vortex dynamics. Several forum members suggested he was observing multiple dust devils forming in sequence at the same location, not a single persistent vortex. Brennan replied that he'd watched the same vortex maintain form for over 90 minutes without any interruption or reformation. It was one continuous structure. On July 12th, Brennan contacted the National Weather Service office in Reno, describing what he'd observed and requesting that a meteorologist visit the site. The office acknowledged his report, but indicated that staff availability and the remote location made an immediate site visit difficult to arrange. They suggested he continue documenting the phenomenon and forward any data he collected. Through July 13th, 14th, and 15th, the dust devil continued to appear. Brennan, Kowalski, and Vasquez maintained regular observations, now joined by several other local residents who'd heard about the phenomenon. The pattern remained consistent, formation beginning around 3:10 to 3:15 in the afternoon, maintaining stable form and position through the late afternoon, and being absent when observers checked the location in the morning. Brennan documented that the dust devil's diameter remained between 38 and 42 feet at ground level across all observations. The height was more difficult to measure precisely, but appeared consistent at approximately 180 to 200 feet. The rotation speed based on timing debris movement within the vortex remained constant at roughly one complete rotation every 4 to 5 seconds. On July 16th, two meteorologists from the National Weather Service in Reno, Dr. Patricia O'Malley, and research technician David Sanchez visited the site. They arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon with portable weather monitoring equipment. The dust devil formed at 3:11. Dr. O'Malley's instruments confirmed Brennan's earlier measurements. Ambient conditions were not typical for dust devil formation, yet a stable vortex had formed and was maintaining itself without apparent cause. Dr. O'Malley deployed a weather balloon with sensors to measure vertical temperature and wind profiles. The data showed a modest temperature inversion at approximately 500 feet elevation, but nothing that would explain sustained vortex formation. She noted in her field report that the atmospheric instability necessary to sustain such a vortex should dissipate within minutes, yet the structure persisted for hours. Most troubling was the dust devil's position stability. Dr. O'Malley measured its coordinates with GPS. The center of the vortex at ground level remained within a circle no more than 6 feet in diameter throughout the observation period. Dust devils moved. This one didn't. It rotated in place as though tethered to the ground. On July 17th, Dr. O'Malley returned with additional equipment, including a Doppler radar unit to measure wind velocities within the vortex. The radar data showed classic rotating wind patterns, but with an anomaly. The wind speeds decreased with altitude far more slowly than expected. Typically, a dust devil's rotation weakened rapidly with height. This one maintained strong rotation well into the upper portions of the column, suggesting an energy source that couldn't be identified. The Naval Air Station Fallon was contacted on July 18th to determine whether any operations or equipment might be influencing atmospheric conditions in the area. The Public Affairs Office responded that no operations were being conducted near the reported location, and that the area was outside the station's active training ranges. They declined further comment. By July 19th, the phenomenon had attracted attention from media outlets in Reno and Las Vegas. A television crew from Reno visited the site, filming the dust devil and interviewing witnesses. The segment aired on July 20th, describing the mystery dust devil that had persisted for nearly 2 weeks. The story was picked up by weather enthusiast websites and forums, generating speculation about causes ranging from geological venting to atmospheric resonance effects. Dr. Raymond Torres, a physics professor from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, with expertise in fluid dynamics, reviewed Dr. O'Malley's data at her request. His analysis, completed on July 21st, confirmed that the observed vortex characteristics were inconsistent with understood dust devil mechanics. He noted that persistent vortices exist in nature. Tornadoes can maintain form for extended periods, and certain atmospheric conditions can create long-lived whirlwinds. But these required continuous energy input from weather systems. The Fallon dust devil appeared to be self-sustaining in conditions that should not support such sustained rotation. On the morning of July 22nd, the 11th consecutive day of documented observations, multiple observers arrived at the site early, hoping to witness the formation process in detail. Michael Brennan was present by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, along with Dr. O'Malley, 7 local residents, and 2 journalists. At 3:09 in the afternoon, dust began rising from the now familiar coordinates. Within minutes, the vortex had formed to its standard dimensions. Observers remained until after sunset. The dust devil continued rotating as darkness fell, still visible in the light of vehicle headlights and portable work lights, a column of moving dust against the night sky. At approximately 8:30 p.m., as ambient temperature dropped and winds calmed, the dust devil was still rotating. Observers left around 9 p.m., the vortex still intact. The following morning, July 23rd, Brennan arrived at the site at 8 a.m. The dust devil was gone. That afternoon, observers gathered as usual. 3:15 passed. No dust devil formed. They waited until 5 p.m. Nothing occurred. July 24th, 25th, and 26th passed without the dust devil reappearing. The pattern that had held for 11 consecutive days had broken. Whatever had sustained the phenomenon for nearly 2 weeks had stopped. Dr. O'Malley examined the location where the dust devil had been anchored. The ground showed no unusual features, just typical desert soil, rocks, and sparse vegetation. She collected soil samples and conducted a ground-penetrating radar survey of the area. The analysis revealed nothing anomalous. No underground cavities, no thermal vents, no buried objects or geological structures that might explain the phenomenon. The circle where the dust devil had rotated for 11 days showed one curious feature. Within a radius of approximately 20 feet from the center point, the ground surface appeared undisturbed. The dust and small debris that typically accumulated during windstorms was absent. The area was swept clean, as though carefully maintained, showing no evidence of disturbance beyond the normal weathering. It was as if the dust devil, while rotating and moving air violently enough to lift dust hundreds of feet into the air, had somehow left the ground beneath it perfectly still. Dr. O'Malley submitted a comprehensive report to the National Weather Service in August of 2010, documenting the observations, measurements, and witness accounts. The report concluded that the phenomenon was unexplained by current meteorological understanding and recommended further study if similar events occurred. The report was filed in the Western Region Archive and not widely disseminated. Michael Brennan wrote an article about the dust devil for a meteorology journal in late 2010. The article was rejected for publication, with reviewers noting that while the documentation appeared thorough, the described phenomenon was too inconsistent with established atmospheric science to be credible without additional verification. Brennan posted his data and observations on his personal website, where they remain accessible. The location northeast of Fallon remains unmarked. The coordinates where the dust devil rotated for 11 days in July 2010 are documented in field reports and GPS logs, but there's nothing at the site to indicate anything unusual ever occurred there. It's open desert, indistinguishable from thousands of acres of similar terrain in the Lahontan Valley. But in the records kept by a retired meteorologist and a research scientist from the National Weather Service, there exists documentation of 11 days when a column of rotating air formed each afternoon at the same time, in the same place, maintaining the same dimensions and rotation speed, defying wind patterns and atmospheric conditions, remaining absolutely stationary while every principle of vortex dynamics insisted it should move or dissipate. And then, on the 12th day, it simply didn't return, leaving behind only a circle of undisturbed ground and the question of what had held it there in the first place, and what, finally, had let it go. Some storms refuse to end on their own terms, and in the summer of 2010, a column of rotating air near Fallon decided when and how it would stop. Fallon sits in Churchill County in western Nevada, approximately 60 miles east of Reno in the Lahontan Valley. The town serves as the service center for one of Nevada's few agricultural regions sustained by irrigation from the Newlands Project, one of the first federal reclamation efforts in the American West, completed in the early 1900s. The surrounding landscape is high desert transitioning to alkali flats, with elevations around 3,900 feet. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees, and the valley experiences persistent winds, particularly in spring and summer when thermal gradients create strong convective currents. Dust devils are common in the region. Small, short-lived whirlwinds formed when intense surface heating creates columns of rising air that begin to rotate. They typically last seconds to minutes, move erratically across open terrain, and dissipate when atmospheric conditions change or when they encounter obstacles. They're a routine feature of desert summers, unremarkable except for their occasional size. The Naval Air Station Fallon occupies a significant portion of land north and east of town, serving as the Navy's premier air-to-air and air-to-ground training facility. The station encompasses hundreds of square miles of restricted airspace and ground ranges. Civilian access to much of the surrounding area is limited, though ranchers still operate on Bureau of Land Management land adjacent to military boundaries. On July 7, 2010, a dust devil formed on BLM land approximately 9 miles northeast of Fallon, near the boundary of the Naval Air Station's training range. The formation occurred at approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, observed initially by a rancher named Walter Kowalski, who was checking fence lines in his pickup truck. Kowalski noticed the dust devil because of its size. He estimated it at roughly 40 feet in diameter at its base, with a visible column extending upward perhaps 200 feet. Dust devils of that size weren't unusual, but this one caught his attention because it remained stationary. Most dust devils moved across the landscape, but this one stayed in place, rotating steadily in the same location. He watched it for approximately 10 minutes while completing his fence inspection. When he drove away, the dust devil was still there, rotating at what appeared to be a constant speed, not dissipating or moving. He thought little of it at the time. Desert weather produced odd atmospheric effects, and a dust devil persisting for 10 or 15 minutes, while unusual, wasn't extraordinary. The following afternoon, July 8th, Kowalski was working in the same area at approximately the same time. The dust devil was there again, in what appeared to be the exact same location, with the same dimensions and rotation characteristics. He drove closer this time, parking about 100 yards away. Through binoculars, he observed the column of rotating dust and debris. It maintained a consistent form, a clearly defined cylindrical shape, rotating counterclockwise, with dust and small debris visible in the vortex. He watched for half an hour. The dust devil didn't move, didn't change size, didn't show any signs of weakening. When he finally drove away at 4:30, it was still rotating. On July 9th, Kowalski returned deliberately to observe the phenomenon. He arrived at 2:45 in the afternoon. No dust devil was visible. At approximately 3:12, he noticed dust beginning to rise from a specific point on the ground, the same location where the dust devil had been the previous 2 days. Within 3 minutes, the full vortex had formed, appearing identical to what he'd observed before. Same diameter, same height, same rotation speed. He documented the time and took photographs with a digital camera. He remained until 4:45, at which point the dust devil was still rotating unchanged. When he returned the next morning to check, there was no trace of it. The ground showed no unusual disturbance. Kowalski mentioned the phenomenon to his neighbor, Linda Vasquez, who ranched adjacent property. On July 10th, both of them drove out to observe. They arrived at 3 o'clock. At 3:13, the dust devil formed in the same location, building from ground-level dust movement to full formation within minutes. Vasquez had brought a video camera and recorded approximately 20 minutes of footage. The recording showed a stable, rotating column of dust maintaining constant dimensions and position. They discussed possible explanations. Vasquez suggested there might be a thermal vent or geological feature creating localized heating that generated a persistent updraft at the same time each day. Kowalski noted that dust devils required specific atmospheric conditions, not just heat, but particular wind patterns and instability, and it seemed improbable that those conditions would replicate precisely at the same time and location for multiple consecutive days. On July 11th, they returned with a third witness, Michael Brennan, a retired Air Force meteorologist who lived in Fallon. Brennan had worked in weather forecasting for 25 years and maintained an interest in atmospheric phenomena. The three arrived at the location at 2:50 in the afternoon. Brennan had brought instruments, a handheld anemometer to measure wind speed, a thermometer, and a compass. The dust devil formed at 3:14. Brennan approached to within 50 feet and took measurements. The wind speed in the vortex registered between 30 and 35 miles per hour at ground level. The ambient air temperature was 103 degrees. He walked around the dust devil's perimeter, noting that the surrounding wind conditions didn't seem conducive to dust devil formation. The ambient wind was light and variable, not strong enough to initiate the rotational dynamics typically necessary. Most significantly, Brennan observed that the dust devil wasn't moving. Dust devils form when rotating columns of air move across terrain, picking up dust and debris. They travel, sometimes erratically, sometimes in relatively straight lines, but they move. This one remained absolutely stationary, as though anchored to a specific point on the ground. Brennan documented his observations and shared them with colleagues through an online meteorology forum that evening. He described the phenomenon as unprecedented in my experience, and noted that the dust devil's persistence violated basic understanding of atmospheric vortex dynamics. Several forum members suggested he was observing multiple dust devils forming in sequence at the same location, not a single persistent vortex. Brennan replied that he'd watched the same vortex maintain form for over 90 minutes without any interruption or reformation. It was one continuous structure. On July 12th, Brennan contacted the National Weather Service office in Reno, describing what he'd observed and requesting that a meteorologist visit the site. The office acknowledged his report, but indicated that staff availability and the remote location made an immediate site visit difficult to arrange. They suggested he continue documenting the phenomenon and forward any data he collected. Through July 13th, 14th, and 15th, the dust devil continued to appear. Brennan, Kowalski, and Vasquez maintained regular observations, now joined by several other local residents who'd heard about the phenomenon. The pattern remained consistent, formation beginning around 3:10 to 3:15 in the afternoon, maintaining stable form and position through the late afternoon, and being absent when observers checked the location in the morning. Brennan documented that the dust devil's diameter remained between 38 and 42 feet at ground level across all observations. The height was more difficult to measure precisely, but appeared consistent at approximately 180 to 200 feet. The rotation speed, based on timing debris movement within the vortex, remained constant at roughly one complete rotation every 4 to 5 seconds. On July 16th, two meteorologists from the National Weather Service in Reno, Dr. Patricia O'Malley and research technician David Sanchez, visited the site. They arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon with portable weather monitoring equipment. The dust devil formed at 3:11. Dr. O'Malley's instruments confirmed Brennan's earlier measurements. Ambient conditions were not typical for dust devil formation, yet a stable vortex had formed and was maintaining itself without apparent cause. Dr. O'Malley deployed a weather balloon with sensors to measure vertical temperature and wind profiles. The data showed a modest temperature inversion at approximately 500 feet elevation, but nothing that would explain sustained vortex formation. She noted in her field report that the atmospheric instability necessary to sustain such a vortex should dissipate within minutes, yet the structure persisted for hours. Most troubling was the dust devil's position stability. Dr. O'Malley measured its coordinates with GPS. The center of the vortex at ground level remained within a circle no more than 6 feet in diameter throughout the observation period. Dust devils moved. This one didn't. It rotated in place as though tethered to the ground. On July 17th, Dr. O'Malley returned with additional equipment, including a Doppler radar unit to measure wind velocities within the vortex. The radar data showed classic rotating wind patterns, but with an anomaly. The wind speeds decreased with altitude far more slowly than expected. Typically, a dust devil's rotation weakened rapidly with height. This one maintained strong rotation well into the upper portions of the column, suggesting an energy source that couldn't be identified. The Naval Air Station Fallon was contacted on July 18th to determine whether any operations or equipment might be influencing atmospheric conditions in the area. The Public Affairs Office responded that no operations were being conducted near the reported location and that the area was outside the station's active training ranges. They declined further comment. By July 19th, the phenomenon had attracted attention from media outlets in Reno and Las Vegas. A television crew from Reno visited the site, filming the dust devil and interviewing witnesses. The segment aired on July 20th, describing the mystery dust devil that had persisted for nearly 2 weeks. The story was picked up by weather enthusiast websites and forums, generating speculation about causes ranging from geological venting to atmospheric resonance effects. Dr. Raymond Torres, a physics professor from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, with expertise in fluid dynamics, reviewed Dr. O'Malley's data at her request. His analysis, completed on July 21st, confirmed that the observed vortex characteristics were inconsistent with understood dust devil mechanics. He noted that persistent vortices exist in nature. Tornadoes can maintain form for extended periods, and certain atmospheric conditions can create long-lived whirlwinds, but these required continuous energy input from weather systems. The Fallon dust devil appeared to be self-sustaining in conditions that should not support such sustained rotation. On the morning of July 22nd, the 11th consecutive day of documented observations, multiple observers arrived at the site early, hoping to witness the formation process in detail. Michael Brennan was present by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, along with Dr. O'Malley, 7 local residents, and 2 journalists. At 3:09 in the afternoon, dust began rising from the now familiar coordinates. Within minutes, the vortex had formed to its standard dimensions. Observers remained until after sunset. The dust devil continued rotating as darkness fell, still visible in the light of vehicle headlights and portable work lights, a column of moving dust against the night sky. At approximately 8:30 p.m., as ambient temperature dropped and winds calmed, the dust devil was still rotating. Observers left around 9 p.m., the vortex still intact. The following morning, July 23rd, Brennan arrived at the site at 8 a.m. The dust devil was gone. That afternoon, observers gathered as usual. 3:15 passed. No dust devil formed. They waited until 5 p.m. Nothing occurred. July 24th, 25th, and 26th passed without the dust devil reappearing. The pattern that had held for 11 consecutive days had broken. Whatever had sustained the phenomenon for nearly 2 weeks had stopped. Dr. O'Malley examined the location where the dust devil had been anchored. The ground showed no unusual features, just typical desert soil, rocks, and sparse vegetation. She collected soil samples and conducted a ground-penetrating radar survey of the area. The analysis revealed nothing anomalous. No underground cavities, no thermal vents, no buried objects or geological structures that might explain the phenomenon. The circle where the dust devil had rotated for 11 days showed one curious feature. Within a radius of approximately 20 feet from the center point, the ground surface appeared undisturbed. The dust and small debris that typically accumulated during windstorms was absent. The area was swept clean, as though carefully maintained, showing no evidence of disturbance beyond the normal weathering. It was as if the dust devil, while rotating and moving air violently enough to lift dust hundreds of feet into the air, had somehow left the ground beneath it perfectly still. Dr. O'Malley submitted a comprehensive report to the National Weather Service in August of 2010, documenting the observations, measurements, and witness accounts. The report concluded that the phenomenon was unexplained by current meteorological understanding and recommended further study if similar events occurred. The report was filed in the Western Region Archive and not widely disseminated. Michael Brennan wrote an article about the dust devil for a meteorology journal in late 2010. The article was rejected for publication, with reviewers noting that while the documentation appeared thorough, the described phenomenon was too inconsistent with established atmospheric science to be credible without additional verification. Brennan posted his data and observations on his personal website, where they remain accessible. The location northeast of Fallon remains unmarked. The coordinates where the dust devil rotated for 11 days in July 2010 are documented in field reports and GPS logs, but there's nothing at the site to indicate anything unusual ever occurred there. It's open desert, indistinguishable from thousands of acres of similar terrain in the Lahontan Valley. But in the records kept by a retired meteorologist and a research scientist from the National Weather Service, there exists documentation of 11 days when a column of rotating air formed each afternoon at the same time, in the same place, maintaining the same dimensions and rotation speed, defying wind patterns and atmospheric conditions, remaining absolutely stationary while every principle of vortex dynamics insisted it should move or dissipate. And then, on the 12th day, it simply didn't return, leaving behind only a circle of undisturbed ground and the question of what had held it there in the first place, and what finally had let it go.